For 5 years I sat in the darkness listening through the ring my daughter wore, watching her endure abuse and humiliation at the hands of her husband's family. When he finally shoved her out the door and screamed, "Get out! You're nothing but a distraction!" He had no idea he was signing his own death warrant. I didn't come here to argue or negotiate. I came to reclaim everything that was stolen from me. The empire he is so proud of will crumble by tomorrow morning. My daughter is finally coming home, and his nightmare is just beginning. I'm deeply grateful to have you here for this journey. To help me get to know this community, please comment below. Which city or country are you watching from? I read every single response. Note: this story includes fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Any link to actual people or places is accidental, but the core lesson I'm sharing is valuable. I sat behind my mahogany desk at the Whitaker estate, a man who had spent 3 decades bending the market to my will, and for the first time in my life, I felt the sharp, cold needle of helplessness. My daughter Samantha sat across from me, her face glowing with the naive light of a woman who thought she had found love in a coffee shop. She was 27, the sole heir to a $4.2 billion empire, and she was asking for my blessing to marry a man who thought she worked for minimum wage at a grocery store. I knew who Brock Caldwell was before she even finished her sentence. I had the files. I had his debts, his gambling history, and his mother's penchant for petty cruelty. A man like that doesn't hunt for love. He hunts for leverage. My instinct, the one that had saved my company from hostile takeovers a dozen times, was to bury him. I could have liquidated his father's construction firm by noon. I could have ensured Brock never stepped foot in Los Angeles again. But as I looked at Samantha, I saw the ghost of her mother in her eyes, that stubborn, fierce independence that simply refused to be sheltered. If I used my power to snatch her away from him, she would only run faster into his arms, convinced that her father was the villain of her fairy tale. "His name is Brock Caldwell," she told me, her voice ringing with the kind of certainty that only comes from being 27 and in love. "He doesn't know who I am, Dad. He thinks I'm just a girl stocking produce." I didn't move. I didn't scold. I just watched her, calculating the cost of my silence. "And you intend to keep it that way?" "I need to know if it's real," she said. The irony was suffocating. She wanted to know if a man who smelled like opportunity and desperation was capable of true affection. I knew the answer, but how could I give it to her without breaking the spirit I'd spent my life cultivating? "You understand what you're asking?" I asked, my voice as cold as the marble beneath my desk. "If you marry him as Callista, you lose the Whitaker name. No trust fund, no estate access, no safety net. You are choosing his world. And if he isn't who you think he is, there will be no Whitaker resources to step in." She didn't flinch. She was ready to walk into the fire. I felt a surge of pride so intense it was nearly painful. She was mine through and through. "I agree to the terms," I said, though the words tasted like ash. 5 years. You live like a normal person. I won't interfere. Not for money, not for lawyers, not for protection. If you still want this life after 5 years, I will respect it. I watched her leave, her silhouette framed by the Pacific Palisades light. As soon as the door clicked shut, I pressed a button on my desk. My chief of staff, Desmond, stepped out from the shadows. "Sir, monitor every step," I said, my voice dropping to the low lethal register I reserved for war. "Does she want a normal life? Fine, but I will not let my daughter be destroyed by a cheap gambler. Get the surveillance team ready, and Desmond. Find the most nondescript wedding band you can buy, $12, platinum, but make it look like store-bought silver. Fit it with the best GPS and audio transmitter we have." I stood up and walked to the window. I would be a stranger for 5 years. I would listen to every insult, every lie, and every slap that man landed on my daughter's skin. I would record it all, every miserable detail, until the moment the pattern was complete. They thought they were marrying an anonymous girl. They were actually inviting a $4 billion wrecking ball into their living room. I would wait. I would watch. And God help them, I would destroy them. The chapel was a dismal affair, a cramped, dusty structure that smelled of mothballs and fading dreams, tucked away in the outskirts of a town that didn't know the name Whitaker. I stood in the shadows at the very back, buried behind a heavy velvet curtain, a ghost at the feast of my own daughter's ruin. My tuxedo was worth more than the entire building, yet I felt like a pauper watching his most precious inheritance being handed over to a common thief. Samantha, my Callista, looked radiant, an innocent beam of light in a room that felt more like a funeral parlor for her future than a sanctuary for her love. She was unaware that the simple silver band I'd slipped into her hand that morning was an anchor, a tether to the only safety net she had left, even if she couldn't see the thread. I stayed true to my vow of non-interference. I didn't approach the altar. I didn't offer a trust fund to cushion the fall of her new reality. I didn't bring in a phalanx of security to vet the guests, though every fiber of my being demanded I strip them of their pretenses. I let her walk out of that chapel as Mrs. Caldwell, her hand tucked into the arm of a man who looked at her not with love, but with the predatory satisfaction of a hunter who had finally snagged a prize he knew he didn't deserve. Watching them leave together, Samantha's smile bright with the kind of naive optimism that only exists before life systematically dismantles it, felt like a physical blow to my lungs. Every instinct I had as a man who had built a $4 billion empire, the instinct to protect, to conquer, to eliminate threats, was screaming at me to drag her out of that parking lot to throw Brock Caldwell into the dirt where he belonged. But I held my ground. I stood motionless, my breathing shallow, watching the exhaust of their beat-up sedan curl into the cold air. If I saved her now, she would never understand the nature of the monsters she was courting. She needed to learn that normal was a luxury she couldn't afford with a man like that, and that Brock Caldwell was not a man to be loved. He was a problem to be solved. I drove back to the estate, the silence of my Mercedes feeling like a leaden weight in the cabin. I had 5 years. 5 years of letting her breathe the smog of Brock's world. That evening I retreated to my private library. It was the only place in the estate that felt real. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the darkness, the only glow coming from the bank of monitors Desmond had arranged on my desk. There was the audio feed from the Pasadena apartment. It was a modest, decaying place, cramped, cheap, and filled with the stale air of Brock's indifference. "Did you take the trash out, Callista?" Brock's voice came through the speakers, tinny and impatient. "I'm exhausted, Brock. I worked a 10-hour shift today," Samantha replied. Her voice was thin-tired, lacking the sparkle I had cultivated in her since she was a child. "I didn't ask for a report, I asked for the trash." I watched the waveforms on my screen pulse in rhythm with his condescension. He was a small man in a small life, desperately trying to feel like a giant by stepping on someone who was leagues above him. He was testing the boundaries, seeing how much weight he could stack on her before the structure collapsed. He was a man who enjoyed the sound of his own authority, particularly when it silenced the woman who was actually keeping him afloat. I leaned back, my eyes fixed on the blank wall of the library. Every word was recorded. Every command, every moment of his petty, cruel tyranny was being archived. I could have ended him. I could have bought his father's company, evicted them by midnight, and left them standing on the sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on their backs. But I didn't. Instead, I poured myself a scotch, a liquid gold that tasted like victory long deferred, and simply watched. This was the hardest part of the game. It wasn't the brilliance of the strategy. It was the sheer brutal silence of the waiting. I was a man who had bought companies, reshaped markets, and dictated the flow of capital. But tonight I was just a father sitting in the dark, listening to a stranger dismantle his daughter's spirit. The rage was there, a furnace in my chest, but I suppressed it. I turned it into fuel. I cataloged every instance of his arrogance. I built a mental dossier, a paper trail of his incompetence and his cruelty. They thought they were the masters of the house. They were actually drafting their own prison sentences, one insult at a time. Every time he made her cry, he was just increasing the interest on the debt he'd never be able to repay. I hit record. Every second of their marriage from this point forward was being saved. It was a digital archive of a failing union, a meticulous record of every minor cruelty and every major manipulation. Samantha thought she was starting a new chapter. I knew she was being written into a tragedy, but I would be the one to rewrite the ending. As I sat in the dark, I vowed that by the time the final page was turned, the Caldwell name wouldn't just be ruined, it would be deleted from every ledger, every record, and every memory that mattered. The man thought he was lucky to have found a girl like her. He had no idea he had just walked into a trap that would swallow him whole. 3 months had bled into 4, and the audio feed from the Pasadena apartment had become my daily penance. I sat in my private office at the Whitaker estate, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific Palisades, offering a view of an empire I had conquered, while the speakers on my desk broadcasted the sound of my daughter's life being systematically dismantled. It was a Sunday evening, the kind of evening that should have been reserved for rest, but for Samantha it was an interrogation. The Caldwell family had gathered for what they called Sunday dinner. through the high-fidelity microphone hidden in her ring. I could hear the clatter of silverware, cheap, thin metal scraping against stoneware plates, and the unmistakable heavy silence that always preceded Vernon Caldwell's pronouncements. Vernon was the architect of this misery, a man who possessed the ego of a titan, but the soul of a petty tyrant. He sat at the head of the table, his voice carrying the clipped rhythmic authority of someone who had built a $50 million company through predatory deals and a lifetime of cutting corners. "Callista, dear," Marlene's voice drifted through, dripping with that saccharine artificial sweetness that masked a venomous heart. "I think it is high time we clarified the expectations for your role in this household. You have been with us for 3 months now, and I'm afraid the standards have been lacking." I felt my jaw lock, my hands resting on the mahogany desk curled into fists until the knuckles burned white. I was a man who decided the fates of corporations with a single signature, a man whose word could shift global markets, and yet I was paralyzed by the sound of my daughter's soft, practiced submission. "I understand, Marlene," Samantha said. Her voice was too quiet, too careful. It lacked the fire I had nurtured in her since she could walk. It was the sound of a spirit being sanded down to fit a smaller, sharper box. "Let me be direct," Marlene continued, her tone shifting to the cold, brisk efficiency of a project manager delegating tasks to a subordinate. "You are to handle all daily cleaning, every room, every surface, every corner. Meal preparation is yours, of course, and the kitchen must be kept in pristine condition. No outside employment, it would be a distraction from your family obligations, and no private social engagements without our prior approval. We don't tolerate disruptions to our lifestyle." I leaned forward, the shadows of the office deepening around me. Every word Marlene uttered was a brick in the wall of my daughter's imprisonment. I knew what she was doing. She wasn't just assigning chores. She was performing a totalizing act of subjugation. She was stripping away Samantha's agency, one household obligation at a time, making her feel small, making her feel unworthy of anything outside these 4 walls. Then came Vernon's voice, a low rumble that sounded like grinding stones. "This house operates on a hierarchy, Callista. Brock's mother and I have built a legacy here. We expect that legacy to be respected. Do not test our patience with half measures." I waited for her to speak. I waited for her to stand up, to throw the napkin in his face, to reach into her purse and pull out the Whitaker business card I had slipped into her wallet just in case. But she didn't. "Of course," she murmured. "I understand everything." The silence that followed was suffocating. Brock, my daughter's husband, said nothing, not a word. I could hear the metallic clink of his fork against his plate, the sound of a man who didn't even have the decency to defend his own wife. He was a coward, a hollow vessel of entitlement, who had married Samantha for the fantasy of a woman he could command, and now that he had her, he was letting his parents run her into the ground. When I listened to them assign her the role of a servant in her own home, I realized the full scope of their crime. Theirs wasn't just a sin of cruelty, it was a sin of calculation. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were systematically erasing the woman I had raised, replacing her with a ghost that would eventually be easier to discard. I took a sip of the bourbon I had poured 20 minutes ago, but I couldn't taste the oak or the smoke. All I could taste was the bitter iron of rage. 3 names, I whispered to the empty room. 3 roles, 3 levels of culpability. Vernon was the architect, the mastermind who designed the architecture of her domestic imprisonment. Marlene was the enforcer, the woman who dressed oppression in the robes of tradition and family duty. And Brock was the coward, the man who married my daughter and then stood back silent and complicit while his parents turned her into unpaid labor. I tapped the recording console on my desk, ensuring every second of their arrogance was logged. They thought they were establishing house rules. They thought they were teaching a young bride her place. They were actually building the foundation for an indictment that would eventually see them all behind bars. They had no idea they were sitting at a table with a man who could erase their entire reality with a single phone call. But if I moved now, Samantha would be rescued, not victorious. She had to see it. She had to live through the indignity of the mop and the stove and the washing machine. She had to learn that the most dangerous men are not the ones who shout, but the ones who smile while they take everything from you. I looked at the photograph of Samantha on my desk. The real Samantha, the one who rode horses across the estate and debated fiscal policy with me at age 10. That woman was still in there, buried under layers of fear and manufactured inadequacy. My job wasn't to save her from the Fosters. My job was to make sure she was the one who finally handed them the shovel. "Clean the floors, Samantha," I whispered to the screen, my heart breaking and hardening at the same time. Scrub them until they shine. And while you do learn every crevice of that house, because one day it will all belong to you and you will be the one deciding who gets to stay. I waited until the dinner ended, until the sounds of dishwashing signaled the final degradation of the evening. Only then did I switch off the monitor. My eyes were burning, but I didn't reach for a tissue. I reached for the ledger. It was time to start planning their ruin. I sat in the dim, climate-controlled silence of my private library at the Whitaker estate, the only light in the room coming from the soft blue pulse of the recording console. This was my sanctuary, a room filled with the scent of old parchment, expensive leather, and the weight of secrets. On the desk before me lay the twin to the ring Samantha wore. It was a $12 piece of junk-cheap tarnished silver with a fake gemstone that looked like it had been plucked from a child's toy box. To anyone else, it was a pathetic, unremarkable trinket. To me, it was the most sophisticated piece of military-grade espionage technology ever commissioned by my private labs. "Active," I whispered, and the console flared to life. I heard the sound of a key turning in a lock, followed by the heavy, uneven footsteps of Brock Caldwell. He didn't walk. He stomped the heavy-booted gait of a man who felt entitled to every square inch of floor space he occupied. "Callista, why is the kitchen a mess?" His voice boomed, jagged with that familiar hollow authority he used to compensate for his own inadequacies. I leaned forward, my hands clasping together as if I were about to negotiate a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. I wasn't just Thane Whitaker anymore. I was a judge, a witness, and a hunter. Samantha's voice came back hesitant, trembling like a leaf in a gale. I was working, Brock. I didn't have time to—" "I don't pay you to have time," he snapped. My grip tightened on the edge of the desk until the wood bit into my palms. I could have ended him. One command to my security firm and Brock Caldwell would have been erased from Los Angeles. I could have had him brought to the back of a black SUV and deposited in the middle of the Mojave Desert before the sun hit its zenith. But the fury that burned in my gut wasn't enough to satisfy the debt. He had to be dismantled. He had to be exposed for the small parasitic thing he was, and that required time. I tapped the console, the audio feed clarifying as the software filtered out the ambient room noise. I heard the scuffle, a sharp intake of breath from my daughter, the sickening thud of a body hitting the wall, and then the silence that followed. "Don't ever talk back to me again," Brock hissed, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register that usually preceded a beating. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, a physical constriction that felt like a dying star. I was $4 billion deep in net worth. I had the ear of the governor. I had a private military contractor on speed dial. And yet I was listening to my daughter be abused by a man who couldn't even afford to pay his own electricity bill. "File 001, I whispered, my voice sounding like broken glass in the silent library. My fingers flew across the keyboard, labeling the audio file with a surgical precision I usually reserve for quarterly earnings reports. Timestamp 23/23/17. Subject domestic assault. Perpetrator Brock Caldwell. Severity high. Every second of that audio feed was being encrypted, mirrored to 3 separate off-site impenetrable servers. It was the start of a digital dossier, a modern-day indictment written not in ink but in the echoes of her pain. I listened to Samantha scramble to her feet, her breathing uneven, a soft, broken whimper escaping her lips. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fly into that apartment and rip him apart with my bare hands, but I couldn't. Not yet. If I acted now, the case would be dismissed as a domestic spat. I needed a pattern. I needed a mountain of evidence so high and so inescapable that no jury in the world could look away. "You're not a servant, Samantha," I whispered to the empty room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. "You're an investigator, and you're doing exactly what you were born to do." I watched the waveforms on the screen, the chaotic, jagged spikes of her distress, the calm, arrogant plateau of his dominance. It was a beautiful, terrible piece of data. I turned my attention to the other feed. Nadine was in the kitchen, her voice barely a breath. "It's all right, Callista. Stay with me. Breathe. He doesn't win today." Nadine was my anchor, the one who saw the bruises I couldn't. I heard the soft rustle of an ice pack being applied, the whispered reassurances. She was the one holding the line, the only thing keeping Samantha's spirit from snapping. I owed Nadine more than money could ever pay. I owed her the life of my daughter. "Keep her focused, Nadine," I muttered into my own private mic, knowing she had an earpiece for emergency coordination. "Let him think he has total control. The more he believes he's the king of this house, the harder he'll fall." I sat back, the darkness of the library pressing against me. I was 58 years old, and I had spent 30 years of my life fighting in boardrooms. But this was the only fight that had ever truly mattered. I wasn't fighting for market share. I was fighting for the soul of the only thing I loved in this world. I opened the folder labeled Project Retribution. It was empty except for the single audio file of the first slap. It was a lonely file, a tiny seed of hatred. But over the next few years, I would fill this folder with every scream, every broken promise, every financial lie, every single moment of their pathetic, greedy existence. By the time I was finished, they would be pleading for the mercy they never once offered my daughter. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence of the Pasadena apartment, the calm after the storm. I knew Brock was probably drinking a beer, convinced he was a man among men, convinced he had a wife who would never dare leave. He was so wrong it was almost funny. He was a man playing with a live grenade, and he hadn't realized that the pin had already been pulled 5 years ago. "Sleep tight, Brock," I said to the darkness. "The archive is open." I watched the waveform on my primary monitor, a steady, agonizing pulse that represented my daughter's life. For months I had lived in this dim library, a tomb built of mahogany and surveillance cataloging the slow-motion destruction of a Whitaker heiress. The ring on Samantha's finger had been sending me more than audio. It was transmitting biometric data, and the latest analysis from my Zurich lab had sent a cold shockwave through my chest. "Sir, the analysis is conclusive," Desmond had said, his voice stripped of all emotion, the only register he used when delivering news that would break a lesser man. "The wedding band the Caldwells provided contains heavy metal derivatives, mercury and lead-based compounds designed to absorb through the skin. Cognitive fog, chronic fatigue, systematic neurological deterioration. It is a slow-burn chemical assassination." I hadn't spoken. I had simply stared at my own reflection, ghosting over the monitor, a man who had conquered 3 decades of markets and hostile boardrooms, currently failing the only test that had ever truly mattered. They weren't just bruising her. They were hollowing her out. That evening, through to the ring, I heard the metallic scraping of it being forced back onto her finger after she'd tried to leave it on the vanity. Marlene's voice cut through like a blade. "It's a family tradition, Callista. You wear the ring. Don't take it off again, or we'll have to discuss your compliance." I sat in the darkness, gripping the armrest until my knuckles turned white. I could have ended it in an hour. One call. One team. Marlene was dragged from that apartment before midnight. But if I moved now, they would walk away as victims of billionaire interference, sympathetic unbroken, and free to find another target. "Desmond," I said into the intercom, "I need a heavy metal chelation compound delivered invisibly through the building's water filtration system. If they want to play the long game of poison, we play the game of invisible medicine." "Undetectable, sir. It will be done." I returned to the feed. Samantha sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why I'm so tired, Nadine. I feel like I'm disappearing." "You aren't disappearing," Nadine replied, steady and fierce. "You are gathering strength. The winter is long, but the spring is coming." I leaned back and closed my eyes. The guilt was a stone in my gut that no amount of bourbon could dissolve. I had cleared the path for this. I had let them poison my daughter in the name of a strategy, and the weight of that choice would stay with me long after the Caldwells were dust. But I looked at the files, the abuse records, the fraud trail, the systematic erasure of a woman I had spent 30 years raising, and I made peace with the price. They thought the poison was making her compliant. They didn't understand they were refining her. Every day they kept that ring on her finger was another day they were signing their own irrevocable destruction. "The ring is a weapon," I whispered into my recorder. "The poison is their hubris, and I am the silence that will eventually become their scream." The chelation serum was working. Desmond had confirmed it 48 hours ago, but I still hadn't allowed myself to feel relieved. Relief was a luxury reserved for men who had finished their wars. Mine was still very much in progress. Tonight, the Pasadena apartment was suffocatingly quiet. Through the ring's feed, I could hear the distant drone of a television in the next room, Brock predictably planted on the couch, while my daughter sat on the edge of the guest bed holding a paperback she hadn't turned a single page of. I knew she wasn't reading. I could tell by the rhythm of her breathing, shallow, unchanged, the breathing of a woman who was simply surviving the hour rather than living it. Then came Marlene's voice, slicing through the feed without a knock, without courtesy, without the basic human decency of announcing herself. "The linens for the spare bedroom need changing before Friday. I trust that won't be an inconvenience." 3 seconds of silence. In my experience across 30 years of boardroom negotiations, 3 seconds was the precise interval between swallowing your pride and speaking through the swallow. "Of course, Marlene," Samantha replied. "Smooth, careful, practiced. I'll take care of it." The heels clicked away. The lock caught. The silence returned. I sat back, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to calculate the true cost of my patience. Not in dollars, that ledger had long since lost its emotional weight. I calculated it in time. Samantha was 30 years old. She had spent 3 years of that life being handed laundry lists in a building I secretly owned by a woman who believed she was the sovereign of a kingdom she had simply borrowed. 3 years. My strategy, her tuition. I closed the evidence archive without opening it. "Desmond?" I said quietly. He appeared in the doorway. "Sir?" "Tell Nadine to go to her. Naturally, no agenda, no operational purpose. Just a cup of tea and a conversation about nothing." I paused, the words feeling unfamiliar in my throat. "I want my daughter to laugh tonight, Desmond. That is the only instruction." He left without another word. 7 minutes later, I heard the knock on the guest room door. Nadine's voice warm and unhurried, the soft sound of a kettle, a chair pulled close, and then slowly, reluctantly, like a match struck in a damp room, I heard my daughter's voice lose its careful, manufactured composure. And then she laughed. Once. Brief. Entirely unguarded. Entirely real. I sat in the darkness and did not reach for the bourbon. I did not reach for the evidence files or the tactical ledger or the next phase of the operation. I simply sat still and listened, and I marked the timestamp in the private file I kept separate from all operational records, the file with no tactical function, the one that contained only the moments she proved she was still wholly, irreducibly herself. I labeled the entry, "She is still in there." Tomorrow I will return to the archive. Tomorrow I will continue being the architect. But tonight, I was just a father who had heard his daughter laugh. And tonight that was sufficient. The office was quiet, save for the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the server banks in the adjacent room, a machine that contained the entire wretched reality of the Caldwell family. I sat in my high-backed leather chair, the kind of chair that reminded me exactly where I sat in the hierarchy of Los Angeles. I wasn't just a businessman. I was an observer of human decay. Through the encrypted feed from the ring on Samantha's finger, I heard the familiar sharp click of the front door. Brock Caldwell had returned home. He was drunk again. I could hear it in the way his keys fumbled against the marble entryway, the uneven drag of his heels, and the aggressive way he kicked the door shut. 5 years. I had spent 5 years listening to this performance. It was a monotonous, soul-draining symphony of mediocrity and malice. He didn't walk. He stomped the heavy-booted gait of a man who felt entitled to every square inch of floor space he occupied. I opened the digital ledger on my secondary screen, the one Desmond and his team had been meticulously populating. It was a beautiful, devastating map of his moral collapse. He wasn't just losing money. He was siphoning every cent Samantha earned from her retail job to fund an apartment in Los Feliz for a woman named Sienna Ramsey. I didn't stop him. Instead, I had Desmond log every transaction. I kept a ledger of my own, a ledger that wasn't about money, but about the sheer blinding arrogance of a man who thought he could steal from a Whitaker heiress and call it managing household expenses. There was a woman named Vanessa. I knew everything about her. She was a 25-year-old aspiring influencer, a creature of filters and shallow ambitions who lived in a cramped Los Feliz studio that cost more than she could reasonably justify. The ledger showed Brock's money, my money in a sense, because I was the one keeping the charade of Samantha's retail job alive being bled dry to fund Vanessa's lifestyle. Boutique hotels, stays, designer bags that would be worn for a single Instagram post, and dinners at restaurants where the wine list alone cost more than a month of Samantha's salary. I poured myself a glass of aged bourbon, though I didn't drink. I just liked the way the ice tinkled against the glass, a sound of clarity. What fascinates me about men like Brock isn't their greed, it's their staggering lack of imagination. They think they are the first to walk this path. They think they are clever for hiding a mistress or skimming a few thousand off the top of a company they don't even own. He sat in his living room now. I could hear him on the phone, his voice dropping into that oily, pathetic register he used with her. "Don't worry, babe. The Sunset Heights Commission is coming through. We'll be in Paris by summer." He was promising a vacation he'd never take. He was gambling with money he didn't have, promising a life he couldn't sustain, all while the woman he'd vowed to protect was scrubbing his floors 3 rooms away. I turned my attention to the company finances. My team had been auditing Caldwell Construction for months. The discrepancies were becoming impossible to ignore. Vernon the father was as bad as the son. He was juggling ghost contractors, paying for materials that were never delivered, and padding the payroll with names that didn't exist. It was a classic House of Cards scenario built on the shaky foundation of stolen intellectual property and maintained by the sheer stubborn ignorance of the men involved. But here was the nuance, the part that kept me from ending it all in an hour I didn't want them dead. Not yet. If I simply sued them into bankruptcy, they would walk away as unfortunate businessmen. If I brought the police in on day one, they'd be small-time fraudsters. I wanted them to build. I wanted them to build their own monument to arrogance. I wanted them to reach the absolute zenith of their delusion, to be so convinced of their own brilliance that they would commit a crime so grand, so arrogant, that when the hammer finally fell, it would crush them into dust. I shifted my gaze to the screen displaying Samantha's location. She was in the kitchen washing dishes. I could hear the faint, steady scrubbing, the sound of her life being whittled away. My heart didn't break. My heart hardened. Every stroke of the brush against the porcelain was a debt they would pay back with interest. I started dictating notes to Desmond. Keep tracking the Ramsey expenses, tag every transaction as personal/non-business. Get the IP addresses of their communications. When they decide to move the next big chunk of capital, I want to know exactly which offshore account they think is safe. Sir, Desmond's voice came over the intercom, his tone clinical and detached. The IRS filings from last year are ready. They're light, deliberately light. Good, I said, leaning back. Let them be light. Let them think they've gotten away with it. Arrogance is the best accelerant for a fire. I looked at the ring on my desk, the one that had replaced the surveillance band Samantha wore a duplicate. I played back the recording of Brock's phone call. He was laughing. A hollow, jagged sound. He was so certain. He was so confident that he had married a woman who didn't exist. He thought he was playing a game of chess against a pawn, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was the one in checkmate, and I was simply moving the pieces into place. I closed the ledger. It was late. The city of Los Angeles was spread out beneath me like a circuit board of human failure. I had everything I needed. I had the records, the surveillance, the witnesses, and the patience of a man who knew that justice isn't a bolt of lightning. It's a landslide. It starts with one loose stone, and by the time you realize you're falling, it's far too late to climb back up. My daughter was currently scrubbing a kitchen floor in a house that I secretly owned. She was in pain, she was tired, she was lonely, but she was being forged, and when the fire finally hit this house, she wouldn't be the one burning. I looked down at my hands, steady, unwavering, ready to tighten the noose. Every transaction Brock made was a stitch in the shroud he was believing for himself. I had the patience of a mountain. I had the resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose but everything to reclaim. The game was far from over. In fact, the most interesting part was only just beginning. I sat in my office, the leather of my chair cold against my back, listening to the audio feed through the earpiece. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the Caldwell household was vibrating with the frequency of a brewing storm. Through the lens of Nadine, my anchor in that house, I had orchestrated a series of small, calculated tremors, and today was the day I expected the first crack to widen into a fissure. Marlene Caldwell was a woman who lived for the appearance of control. She curated her home, her husband's reputation, and her son's life with the meticulousness of a museum curator. But curators have one fatal weakness: they cannot stand a smudge on the glass. I had spent the last week ensuring that the glass was not just smudged, it was shattered. Nadine, I murmured into my private secure line, my voice barely audible above the hum of the cooling fans. Initiate Phase 2. Nadine, who was currently dusting the mantel in the formal living room, didn't break her rhythm. Her voice came back through the transmitter as a soft, rhythmic hum, a signal she had received. She had spent weeks observing the delicate balance of power between Marlene and the mistress Vanessa. I had provided Nadine with the ammunition: a series of lost phone records, a misplaced set of keys, and a subtle suggestion about Vanessa's spending habits. The strategy was simple isolation. Vanessa was a creature of convenience. She was with Brock because she believed he was a man of emerging wealth and status. She hadn't signed up for the scrutiny of a mother-in-law who functioned as a surveillance state. I needed them to turn on each other, to consume one another's energy until they were too exhausted to pay attention to Samantha. I heard the heavy thud of the front door. Brock was home early. He didn't look for his wife. He walked straight into the kitchen, his voice laced with the irritation of a man whose life was failing in slow motion. Vanessa, why is the account locked? I tried to pull the funds for the Vegas trip and the bank said the limit was hit. I don't know, Brock. Maybe stop spending money you don't have? Vanessa snapped back. I smiled. The sound of their fighting was music to my ears, a discordant screeching symphony that I had helped compose. But it wasn't enough. I needed them to point their weapons at Marlene. Nadine, I whispered, my eyes tracking the movement on my secondary monitor. Now. Nadine moved with the fluid grace of a ghost. She walked into the kitchen, tray in hand, her face a mask of subservient concern. Excuse me, Mr. Brock, Mrs. Caldwell. I didn't want to overstep, but I found these in the trash this morning. I thought perhaps they were misplaced. She placed a stack of papers on the island. They were forged masterfully so. My team had spent the entire night creating receipts that showed Vanessa had been secretly moving funds into her own private account, and even more importantly, receipts that suggested Marlene had been quietly siphoning money from her son to pay for her own secret club memberships. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a house of cards beginning to sway. What is this? Brock's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. He picked up the papers. Vanessa, you've been taking money from the operating account. What? No, I haven't touched that account. Vanessa's panic was palpable, sharp, and desperate. Look at the signature, Brock. That's not my handwriting. That's Marlene's. I held my breath, leaning closer to the monitor. The trap was set. Don't you dare talk to me like that, Marlene's voice echoed from the hallway, her footsteps sharp on the tile as she stormed into the kitchen. I have never stolen a cent from this family. If there's a thief in this house, it's that woman you brought in here, Brock. Look at how she dresses. Look at the jewelry she wears. My jewelry, Vanessa shrieked. You're the one who told me to take the money from the accounts for the renovation. You said it was a family investment. I never said that. The arguing escalated into a chaotic mess of accusations, blame, and raw, unfiltered hatred. They were tearing each other apart. They weren't fighting about Samantha. They were fighting for the scraps of a dying empire. They were so busy defending their own pathetic territory that they completely forgot about the girl in the guest room. I looked at the feed showing Samantha. She was sitting in the corner of the guest room, a book in her lap, her eyes focused on her studies. She wasn't participating in the war I had started. She was an island of stillness in a sea of madness. That was exactly what I wanted. She was the calm at the center of the hurricane, and the Caldwells were the wind, the rain, and the debris. I leaned back, swirling my bourbon, watching the chaos unfold. This was the beauty of corporate warfare applied to the domestic sphere. You didn't need to defeat your enemy in a direct confrontation. You just needed to ensure they were incapable of seeing the real threat. By the time they realized that Samantha was the one they should have been watching, the FBI would be at their door. Desmond, I said into the intercom, my voice cold detached. The fissure is opening. Prepare the next set of documents. I want to see if we can get them to turn on Vernon by morning. The documents are ready, sir, Desmond replied, his efficiency a soothing comfort. Should I leak them to the local press? No, I said, a dark smile playing on my lips. Not yet. Let them eat each other alive in private first. There's nothing more delicious than a betrayal that goes completely unpunished until the very last second. The feed continued a cacophony of shrieking defensive lies and shattered trust. It was everything I had anticipated. I watched the clock on my wall. In a few hours, the night would pass and they would wake up to the realization that they had absolutely no one left to trust. I had spent my entire life negotiating with board members, politicians, and heads of state, but none of those negotiations had been as rewarding as this. I was conducting an orchestra of misery, and every discord in that house was a note in a song of retribution. You wanted a normal life, Samantha, I whispered to the screen, watching her turn a page in her book, undisturbed by the shouting match 3 rooms away. You wanted to know if love was real. I hope you're getting your answer, because from where I'm sitting, love looks a lot like a collapsing foundation. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, feeling the warmth of the bourbon settle in my veins. My daughter was in that house, and she was miserable, yes, but she was learning the most valuable lesson of all, how to look through a person, how to dismantle their defenses, and how to wait for the exact moment when they were at their most vulnerable. She was learning to be a Whitaker. The yelling in the apartment hit a crescendo. Brock was screaming something about loyalty, while Marlene was sobbing about how she had sacrificed everything for the family. It was a pathetic, small-minded display, the kind of scene that played out in 1,000 failed households across this city every single day. But this one was different. This one was mine. I looked at the stack of files on my desk, the ones Arthur had recovered from the trash. Every piece of paper was a nail in their coffin. I wasn't just observing, I was orchestrating. I was the silent hand moving the pieces, the whisper in the dark that turned brother against brother, wife against mother-in-law. I sat there for hours, a silhouette in the library, a man with $1 billion who was willing to spend every cent of it to make sure justice was served with the precision of a guillotine. The audio feed flickered, a temporary glitch in the connection, but it was enough to make my heart stop. I needed that feed. It was my link to her, my only way of knowing she was breathing. I checked the status of the Ring's battery, still at 90%. It was a small, persistent reminder that I was watching, that I would always be watching, that even when the Fosters thought they were alone, they were being measured, analyzed, and filed away for future prosecution. The night air outside was cooling the city lights below, starting to blur into a soft, hazy glow. I closed my eyes, listening to the final exhausted gasps of the argument as it died down into a sullen, bitter silence. They were going to sleep in a house that was a powder keg, and they had no idea that I had already lit the fuse. Sleep well. I muttered the words, a promise rather than a salutation, because tomorrow we start again. The office went silent as the feed settled into the rhythmic breathing of a broken family, unaware that they were being monitored by the most dangerous man in California. I picked up my pen, took a fresh sheet of paper, and began to outline the next phase. If I was going to ruin them, I would do it right. No half measures, no mercy. Just the slow, inevitable collapse of everything they had worked so hard to steal. And when it was over, I would finally be able to look at my daughter and tell her that she didn't need to fear the dark anymore because I had spent every single night of those 5 years lighting the way out. The darkness of my office felt less heavy now. The weight of the bourbon glass in my hand felt lighter. I was a father on a mission, and for the first time in years, the future didn't look like a fog. It looked like a clear, sharp path toward the exact moment I would see the look on Vernon Caldwell's face when he realized that everything he had built was mine to destroy. Every night I would come here. Every night I would listen. And every night I would become more certain of the end. They thought they were the masters of their domain. They were just guests in a world I had already rewritten in my own image. The silence that returned to the apartment was thick with resentment. It was a perfect, beautiful silence. It was the silence of a trap waiting to be sprung. Secrets are unraveling, and suspicion is eating away at the Foster family from the inside. I've planted the seeds of their collapse. Now I'm just waiting for the harvest. Who do you think will be the first one to betray the others to save their own skin? Comment the name of the character you suspect the most. Arrogance is a messy business. It leaves behind scraps, fragments, and shreds that the arrogant think are beneath their notice. Vernon Caldwell and his son Brock lived their lives in the grand illusion that their secrets were safe because they were wealthy. They didn't understand the first law of corporate intelligence: everything you discard is a weapon in the hands of someone who knows how to read it. I didn't need to break into their office. I didn't need to plant wiretaps in their walls. All I needed was their trash. I hired Arthur Townsend because he was the only man I knew who could find the soul of a corporation in a discarded takeout bag. Arthur didn't look like a forensic investigator. He looked like a weary municipal worker who'd seen too much of the city's refuse. He wore the neon yellow reflective vest and the heavy stained boots of a career sanitation worker. He was to the employees of Caldwell Construction utterly beautifully invisible. Every Tuesday and Friday at 6 a.m., while Brock and Vernon were still dreaming of their next fraudulent contract, Arthur was in the alley behind their commerce office. He didn't just toss the bags into the truck. He sorted. He was a master of the reconstruction, a man who saw a shredded invoice not as trash but as a roadmap to a prison sentence. I watched the live feed from the camera Arthur had hidden in the brickwork of the alley. It was tedious work. He wore gloves, his movements methodical and rhythmic. He would pull out a bag, tear it open, and lay the contents out on a portable sorting table. He didn't just bag the paper, he cataloged it. He had a portable UV scanner, a high-resolution camera, and a vacuum-sealed transport system for anything that looked particularly incriminating. "Any hits today, Arthur?" I spoke into the encrypted channel, my voice low. "Patience, Mr. Whitaker." Arthur replied, his voice gruff, the sound of a man who preferred the company of paper to people. "They're getting careless. The shredder in the back office has been jamming for weeks, and they've been throwing the overflow directly into the bin. It's like they're giving us a gift." I leaned back, watching a fragment of a document appear on my screen. It was a partially burnt receipt from the Riverside Municipal Project. It showed a discrepancy of $43,000, a classic kickback disguised as an equipment rental fee. This was the leverage I needed. Vernon thought he was running a business. He was running a crime scene. Arthur spent 3 hours in that alley every shift. I spent every one of those hours watching him. It was a strange sort of partnership, the billionaire and the garbage man, both obsessed with the debris of a crumbling dynasty. I found myself admiring the work. There was a grim, poetic justice in it. The very waste that Vernon Caldwell tossed aside to keep his hands clean was now becoming the very evidence that would ensure he never touched another dime of stolen money again. "Look at this," Arthur said, holding a piece of paper to the camera lens. It was a carbon copy of a payment to a city zoning official, the RZ approval. It wasn't just a receipt, it was a signed admission of bribery. My pulse, usually as steady as a metronome, jumped. This was the Holy Grail, a direct link between Caldwell Construction and the corrupt Municipal Planning Commission. I didn't just see paper, I saw the end of the Caldwell empire. Every scrap Arthur pulled from that bin was a thread in the noose. "Take it all, Arthur," I ordered, my voice hardening. "I want the shredded fragments, the burnt receipts, the junk mail with their private notes scribbled on the back. If it's in that bin, it's mine. I want them to have nothing left to hide." "It's going into the lockbox, sir," Arthur confirmed. I disconnected the feed and stared at the empty screen. For 30 years, Vernon had treated the law as a suggestion and ethics as a weakness. He had built his reputation by being the smartest man in the room, the one who always had the right documents to show a tax auditor. He was confident he was smug, and he was absolutely catastrophically wrong. He had forgotten that every action leaves a trace, and in the modern world, the most dangerous thing you can do is assume that trash is just trash. I had spent my life studying the art of the deal, the nuances of equity, and the mechanics of power. I knew that control wasn't about what you showed the world. It was about what you were capable of concealing, and the Caldwells. They had spent a lifetime concealing, only to realize too late that they hadn't concealed anything at all. They had just been waiting for me to come along and start digging. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, bathing my office in that pale, early morning light. I had 3 months' worth of evidence sitting in my secure vault now, a collection of ruined dreams and fraudulent signatures. It was enough to bury them. But I wasn't burying them yet. I was still waiting for the right moment. I wanted them to grow their empire a little larger, to take that Sunset Heights project, to get themselves so deeply embroiled in the lie that there was no turning back. I watched the screen as Arthur packed up his gear, his van disappearing into the morning traffic of Los Angeles. He was gone, leaving no trace behind, just a cleaner alleyway, and the knowledge that the Caldwells were now a little bit closer to their inevitable ruin. They thought they were starting their day preparing for another round of high-stakes deception. They didn't know that their morning routine had already been harvested, scanned, and filed under evidence felony. The game was becoming far too easy. That was the only thing that bothered me. I wanted a challenge, but all I had were 2 men who were as predictable as the rise and fall of the tide. They were greedy, they were cruel, and they were profoundly, tragically stupid, and they were going to pay for every single bit of it. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the city wake up. Somewhere down there in a cramped, miserable apartment, my daughter was waking up to a life of service that I had orchestrated for her. And somewhere else in this city, Brock Caldwell was pouring his coffee, oblivious to the fact that his father's trash had just become his judge, jury, and executioner. "Enjoy the morning, gentlemen," I whispered, turning back to my desk. "The evening is going to be much, much longer." The rain didn't just fall that night. It hammered against the glass of my library, a relentless, punishing deluge that felt like the heavens were trying to wash the filth off the face of Los Angeles. I stood at the window, the blue light of the monitors casting long, distorted shadows across my face. I wasn't just Thane Whitaker, the chairman of the Whitaker Group. I was a father watching his daughter's life being torn apart by a man who wasn't fit to tie her shoelaces. It was the 5th anniversary of their marriage, a date that should have been a celebration. Instead, it was the night the mask finally slipped. Through the earpiece, I heard the engine of Brock's car pull into the driveway, the metallic groan of an old vehicle struggling against the mud. I felt every revolution of that engine. I heard the door slam, a sound that vibrated through my own chest. I knew the tone of his voice before he even spoke. It was the sharp, jagged pitch of a man who had hit a wall and decided to take his frustration out on the nearest soft target. "You're late," he shouted, his voice echoing through the kitchen feed. "I was shopping, Brock, you knew that." Samantha's voice was tired, stretched thin by the weight of the months of isolation I had forced her to endure. I despised myself for it, but I knew, God help me, I knew that this was the only way. Shopping with whose money? The sound that followed was unmistakable. It wasn't just a slap. It was an impact, a sharp, sickening collision of hand against bone that made the microphone peak in the red. I didn't flinch. I had seen this on the monitors 26 times before, but this one was different. It felt like a threshold being crossed. "Get out!" Brock bellowed. I was already moving before he finished the sentence. I had the car ready. I had Desmond and the security team staged 3 blocks away, waiting in the shadows of the rain-slicked streets. I didn't just hear the violence. I timed it. I heard the struggle, the scrape of her boots against the hardwood, the heavy, aggressive shove toward the front door. I said, "Get out, you're nothing but a distraction." The door slammed. The sound of the deadbolt locking was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It was the closing of one chapter and the violent, necessary opening of the next. I stood in the center of my library, my breathing ragged. For 5 years I had been the silent observer, the patient predator, the man who let his daughter bleed so that he could harvest the truth. But the moment that door locked, the mercy I had been pretending to hold on to evaporated. Mercy was for those who deserved it. These people were vermin, and I was finished with the pest control phase. I was ready for the extermination. "Desmond," I said, my voice low, dangerous, and perfectly calm. "She is at the gate. Bring her home." I watched the screen as Samantha walked down the driveway, the rain soaking through her clothes, her head bowed against the storm. She didn't look like a billionaire's daughter. She looked like a survivor. I didn't reach for the intercom to speak to her. I didn't want to talk. I wanted to act. I picked up my phone and dialed the number I had kept sequestered for years. This wasn't a call to a friend. It was an activation code for a scorched earth policy. "It's time," I said to the person on the other end. "All of it. The construction fraud, the patent theft, the assault records, the insurance scheme. Submit everything to the FBI. Copy the district attorney's office and the local press. I want them to wake up tomorrow morning to a world that has already decided they are criminals." I looked at the monitor again. My daughter had reached the gate. Desmond was already there holding an umbrella, his posture reflecting the reverence he held for the woman she had become. He opened the car door. She stepped inside and the feed cut off. The silence that followed in the apartment was deafening. I could hear Brock on the other side of the audio feed pacing, muttering to himself, still convinced he had won. He was sitting in a house that belonged to me, surrounded by evidence that would send him to prison for a decade, and he was still laughing. It was a pathetic, empty sound. He didn't know that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one I was bringing to his front door. I walked over to my desk and pulled out a bottle of whiskey that hadn't seen the light of day since the funeral of my wife. I poured 2 glasses. I set one on the desk empty and held the other. "To Thomas Aldridge," I whispered to the empty room, "and to the death of the Caldwell name." I drank the burn of the alcohol, matching the fire in my veins. The 5-year experiment was over. The observation period had ended. The data was collected, analyzed, and finalized. Now it was time for the application of force. I had spent years watching them play their little games, and I had learned every rule, every move, and every weakness. The rain continued to hammer against the house, washing away the mud, washing away the pretense. Tomorrow the sun would rise, but it wouldn't shine on the Caldwells anymore. It would shine on a Whitaker who was finally undeniably free. And I would be the one standing in the shadows watching the light return to my daughter's eyes, while the people who tried to break her realized that they hadn't just angered a man, they had angered a god. The silence of my library had always been a sanctuary, but tonight it felt like a tactical war room. My earpiece was still buzzing with the residual sound of the rain-drenched streets of Pasadena, but my focus had shifted entirely to the audio feed currently looping in my ears. Vernon and Brock were in the office, their voices low, confident, and utterly devoid of humanity. They weren't discussing construction bids or zoning permits. They were discussing the disposal of my daughter. 3 weeks. The stairs late night, you call 911 distraught. Vernon's voice was the sound of dry leaves on pavement, crisp, heartless, and efficient. Coroner rules accidental fall. Make sure you cry real tears, Brock. This has to look real. I sat in my high-backed chair, the darkness of the room pressing against me, but I felt a strange, cold clarity. For 4 years and 9 months I had been a ghost, a silent watcher, a patient predator. I had let them bruise her, mock her, and poison her, all in the name of a lesson I was teaching her about the world. But as they talked about the staircase, about the $10 million insurance policy they had increased without her knowledge, the lesson died. The experiment was over. They had crossed a line that not even a Whitaker could endure. They weren't just exploiting Samantha. They were discarding her. "The $10 million policy is solid," Brock asked, his voice thick with the greed that had defined every moment of his pathetic existence. "She doesn't know we increased it." "Increased it 6 months ago." Vernon replied, his tone as casual as a man discussing the weather. She signed the renewal without reading it, just put it in the pile with the other household documents. Beneficiary you, payout 10 million, clean, simple, done. I stared at the monitor, my hands flat on the desk, feeling the weight of the power I had kept on a leash for so long. I had the power to make them vanish. I had the power to turn their names into echoes in an empty room. And yet I had waited. I had let my daughter endure the bruises, the cold, and the isolation. I looked at the photograph of Samantha on my desk, her face vibrant and alive in a picture from before the marriage, and the guilt that had been a dull ache suddenly sharpened into a blade. I had given her the ring as a tether, a way to know she was alive. But tonight that tether was the only thing standing between her and a cold marble floor at the bottom of a staircase. They thought they had 3 weeks. They thought they were the ones in control, the architects of a perfect, bloodless crime. They didn't know that every single word they spoke in that office was being fed directly into the heart of the man who owned their world. I didn't call the police. I didn't send a letter. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen glowing against the darkness of the library. My thumb hovered over Desmond's number, the line that initiated the end of the Caldwell dynasty. Desmond, I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of an executioner. The plan is accelerated. They're planning to murder her in 3 weeks. Get me the policy documents tonight and send the team to initiate the perimeter protocols. Sir, Desmond's voice was steady as always. Does this mean the observation phase is complete? The observation phase is dead. I replied, my eyes burning with a resolve that felt like iron. I don't want a court case in 3 years. I want them ruined. I want them exposed, and I want them broken. I need proof of their intent. Get me the policy, get me the beneficiary forms, and get me anything that links the staircase to their financial gain. I hung up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had 4 years of recorded abuse, 18 months of fraud evidence, and now the written intent for murder. I had everything. But more than that, I had the cold, terrifying knowledge that I was the one who had allowed this to happen. I had held the cards, and I had chosen to let the game play out. I looked at the ring on my desk, the duplicate I kept as a reminder. It was just metal, just technology, but it had heard the sounds of their souls rotting. They didn't just want Samantha's money. They wanted to erase her because she was the one thing they couldn't control. They were small, terrified men who needed to destroy beauty because it reminded them of their own ugliness. 3 weeks. They thought they had 3 weeks to craft their masterpiece of a murder. I had 3 weeks to transform their lives into a nightmare from which there would be no waking up. I stood up, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a father. And a father is the most dangerous thing a man can ever be because he has nothing left to fear. The plan to murder my daughter was set. April 18th. A staircase accident. A $10 million insurance policy. Vernon and Brock were not just thieves, they were predators who had chosen the wrong prey. Samantha was already home safe inside the estate, the door locked behind her for the first time in 5 years. But I was not finished. Bringing her home was only the first move. The second move required my face. I needed Vernon Caldwell to look into the eyes of the man he had underestimated, the man whose house he had lived in, whose money he had spent, and whose daughter he had planned to bury at the bottom of a staircase. Desmond, I said, my voice steady and hard as steel, prepare the car. I'm going to the Pasadena apartment personally, not to retrieve anyone, to deliver a message. Sir, are you planning to reveal yourself? Desmond hesitated. The Fosters still do not know who you are. Yes, I said, rising from my chair, the power of my position coursing through my veins. It is time they saw the face of the man from whom they have taken everything. Tonight I will not become a billionaire. I come as a father, the man they assumed meant nothing to Samantha. I drove the black sedan into the heart of the torrential downpour that was hammering Los Angeles. When I arrived in front of the Caldwell residence, everything was silent, save for the drumming of rain on the rusted metal roofs. I stood there bathed in the yellow glare of the streetlights, looking at the miserable, decaying apartment where my daughter had endured 5 years of humiliation. I didn't bring security. I didn't hide behind my influence. I stood there like a ghost from the past, a silent witness finally ready to break his vow of non-interference. When Samantha stepped out of the apartment, forced out by Brock after a night of rage, she looked like a leaf torn from a branch in a hurricane. Her hair was plastered to her skull, her face pale with the exhaustion of 1,000 quiet tragedies. When she saw me, a man in a tailored suit standing in the freezing night, she stopped dead in her tracks. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling. I stepped forward, not saying a word, and wrapped my heavy overcoat around her shoulders. The scent of rain and my daughter's skin mingled, igniting a protective instinct I had stifled for 5 long years. I saw the bruise on her cheek, the scar of her survival. A wave of lethal rage surged within me, but I crushed it. Now was not the time for chaos. Now was the time for precision. The apartment door swung open and Brock appeared, arrogant and lurching, still clutching a wooden club, ready to scream something about her leaving. He stood there eyeing me with that cheap, practiced contempt, never realizing that the man standing before him was the actual owner of the roof over his head and the owner of the very air he breathed. "Hey, you old man, what the hell are you?" Brock started, but he fell silent the moment I turned to face him. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him with the cold, dead eyes of a man who had seen his ending a decade ago. He took a step back, the low-budget bravado on his face dissolving into confusion as he encountered an authority he had never dared to imagine. "Samantha," I said, turning to her, my voice softening instantly. "You have finished your lesson. It is time to come home." I didn't wait for her answer. I took her hand, leading her past Brock without so much as a glance. He stood frozen, perhaps trying to piece together why a stranger possessed such an aura of absolute command. As I guided her into the waiting black Mercedes, I looked back at that wretched house one last time. Vernon was standing at the window watching with growing terror. He was beginning to realize that something was fundamentally wrong. This was no passerby. This was the one man he never wanted to cross. "Why are you here, Father?" Samantha asked as the car pulled into the dark night. "Because I have been listening to everything," I answered, meeting her eyes. "And because I will not let you listen to them for 1 second longer." In the car, I handed her the report detailing the murder plot they had been discussing. As Samantha read the lines about the staircase accident, her hands shook, but her eyes were no longer fearful. They were clear. Tonight, I had brought her home, and from this moment, the game had shifted. I turned to Desmond. "Show them who we are. Tonight, send Vernon a copy of the insurance policy they just altered. Let them see that we know and that we are watching." That night, the Foster household did not sleep. I knew this because through the surveillance system, I could hear Vernon pacing his room, the frantic sounds of phone calls being made. Fear had begun to consume them. I had brought my daughter home, but my real work, the work of destroying everything they had stolen, was only just beginning. The mask did not fall with a crash. It dissolved the way cheap paint peels from a neglected wall when the heat finally becomes too intense. I stood in the shadows of the Whitaker Estate's grand foyer, watching through the bank of monitors as the internal combustion of the Caldwell household reached its critical temperature. My home, the place they had been renting unknowingly, was no longer a residence. It was a pressurized chamber, and I had tightened the valves. Vernon Caldwell sat in the living room, a glass of scotch clutched in his hand, his knuckles white against the crystal. He was staring at the envelope I had sent over by courier an hour ago, the accelerated insurance policy, the beneficiary change form, the document detailing the accident scheduled for the 18th. He wasn't reading it anymore. He was staring through it at the void where his future used to be. "How?" Vernon whispered. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was talking to the ghosts of the people he had wronged, the people he had assumed were too weak to fight back. How could they possibly know about the policy? They. Brock was pacing the room behind him, his face a mask of sweating, twitching panic. "We need to leave, Dad. We need to pack the cash and leave the country. If the insurance company is alerted, if the police have these documents, we're finished. We are absolutely, fundamentally finished." I leaned forward, my fingers drumming against the mahogany armrest of my chair. I felt no pity. I felt the electric thrill of a chess player who has just pushed his opponent into the final corner. "Desmond," I said into the intercom, my voice low and vibrating with cold authority. "Initiate the next phase. I want the local press to receive the anonymous tip about the zoning bribes. I want the city council to wake up to a scandal they can't bury." "It is done, sir," Desmond replied. His voice was a calm, steady rhythm against the chaotic shrieking of the Caldwell household. "The emails are being distributed as we speak. By dawn, the city will be calling for Vernon's head on a platter." I turned my attention back to the monitor. Marlene had entered the room, her burgundy silk robe clutched tightly around her, her eyes darting between her husband and her son. She was the one who had choreographed the social status, the one who had curated the lie, and now she was the one who looked the most fragile. "Vernon," she said, her voice a fragile, brittle thing. What are they talking about? What policy? We're ruined, Marlene! Brock screamed, finally snapping. He grabbed the vase from the coffee table and hurled it against the wall, the porcelain shattering into 1,000 white shards that scattered across the pristine rug. She's gone. She was the key. We were supposed to collect the payout on the 18th, and now she's with whoever that man was. Who was he? Marlene demanded, grabbing Brock by the lapels of his suit. Who did she leave with? She was supposed to be a nobody. She was supposed to be a charity case. I felt a surge of grim laughter rise in my throat. A charity case. They had spent 5 years treating my daughter as an accessory, a tool, a servant, never once looking at her, never once listening to the woman who was quietly, methodically, and brilliantly dissecting their entire lives from the inside out. She wasn't a nobody, Vernon said, his voice dropping into a dazed, hollow whisper. I looked at the car she got into. It was a Mercedes, a custom bulletproof armored vehicle. That wasn't a stranger, that was an owner. He turned to the wall, his eyes searching the photographs he had displayed there, the family portraits, the images of his legacy. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he hadn't just been outsmarted by a woman, he had been outplayed by a shadow. He had been playing for survival while I had been playing for total annihilation. I stood up and paced the library, the air thick with the smell of my own victory. This was the moment I had craved for 5 years. Not the shouting, not the panic, not even the FBI raid that was coming. It was the realization. I wanted them to know that their entire world, every luxury, every contract, every lie they had built was not just stolen, it was borrowed from me. They had been living in my shadow, eating my food, and spending my money while they plotted to kill the most valuable thing in my life. Desmond, I commanded, stopping in the center of the library, my reflection caught in the dark glass of the bookshelf. Do they know who I am yet? They are currently Googling your name, sir. The association with Whitaker Holdings is beginning to appear in their search history. They are in the process of realizing that they have been living in a house owned by the man they intended to rob. I let out a slow, steady breath. The walls of their reality were collapsing. They were scrambling, reaching for threads that had already been cut. They were trying to call lawyers who were already preparing their cases against them. They were trying to flee to an airport that had already been alerted to their travel plans. Let them realize it. I said, my voice as cold as the deep space between stars. I want them to know that every time they slept, every time they ate, every time they plotted, they were doing so under my roof and at my expense. I want that knowledge to be the last thing they think about before the agents break down their door. I turned back to the monitors. Brock was on his knees now, his hands over his face, sobbing, a weak, sniveling sound that lacked any trace of the masculinity he had spent his life posturing about. Vernon sat frozen, a man who had finally understood that he had played a game he didn't even understand the rules of. Marlene was staring at the floor, the realization of her social ruin hitting her harder than the news of the impending prison sentences. They had been masquerading as the architects of their own destiny, while I had been the puppet master pulling the strings of their ambition until they were tied into a knot of their own making. I took a sip of my drink, feeling the heat of it. This wasn't just justice. This was a realignment of the universe. They had been arrogant, and I had been absolute. They had been greedy, and I had been patient. They had been small, and I had been vast. I looked at my watch. It was nearing midnight. The night was cold, but the internal temperature of the Caldwell house had reached a level of absolute zero. They were huddled together not as a family, but as co-conspirators in a collapsing structure. Desmond, I said, turning away from the screens. The police have the address. The warrant is signed. Let's finish this. Yes, sir, he replied. Shall I lead the press to the scene? Make sure they have front row seats, I said. I want every tabloid in Los Angeles to see the moment the Caldwell legacy finally runs out of borrowed time. I didn't need to watch the raid. I didn't need to see the handcuffs or the flashing lights. I knew the scene by heart, had choreographed it in my mind for years. I walked to the window, the rain having stopped the city lights below beginning to shimmer like diamonds. The mask had fallen. The truth was laid bare, and for the first time in 5 long, grueling years I could feel the weight of my daughter's life being returned to my care safe sound, and finally free of the parasites that had tried to consume her. I felt a ghost of a smile grace my lips. They had tried to sell her life for $10 million. They had failed to realize that she was priceless, and for that mistake they would lose everything they ever had. The night was quiet. The city was still. But in the morning the world would know the names of the Caldwells not as successful businessmen, but as the small, greedy thieves they had always been. I had played the long game, and I had won. Now it was time for the rest of my life to begin. The Biltmore Ballroom was a stage I had painstakingly constructed, every detail calibrated to ensure the Caldwells' destruction was both total and theatrical. As I stood in the shadows near the grand entrance, flanked by the cold, reassuring presence of Desmond, I watched the final act begin. The FBI agents entered not as interlopers, but as the inevitable conclusion to a 5-year narrative. Vernon and Brock stood in the center of the room, their faces reflecting the dawning realization that their world had shrunk to the size of a pair of handcuffs. For Vernon, the arrest was not just a legal inconvenience. It was the annihilation of the only currency he had ever respected: reputation. I watched as the lead agent approached his movements, devoid of malice, purely procedural. Vernon Caldwell. Brock Caldwell. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, tax evasion, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy to commit murder. The words hung in the air, amplified by the stunned silence of the ballroom. I felt a surge of cold, crystalline satisfaction. This was the moment I had calculated for thousands of hours in the dark. Every scrap of paper Arthur recovered from the trash, every diary entry Nadine had meticulously penned, every audio file that had vibrated through the ring on Samantha's finger, it all culminated here in the cold click of steel against their wrists. Brock's bravado shattered instantly. The man who had once slapped my daughter for the crime of being a distraction was now sobbing, his voice climbing into a high, discordant register that made the elite guests draw back in disgust. He was looking around the room, searching for an exit, a lawyer, a miracle. He found none. He looked toward me, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he were trying to comprehend the sheer scale of his failure. I didn't offer him a glance. I didn't offer him the dignity of my attention. Vernon, however, remained frozen. He was a man who had built his life on the belief that he was the smartest person in the room. Even now, with the weight of the law bearing down on him, he was trying to categorize this, to find the angle, the loophole, the bribe that would make it go away. He looked at the agent, his voice trembling but still projecting that pathetic remnant of authority. "This is a mistake. My attorney—" "Your attorney is currently filing evidence against you, Mr. Caldwell," the agent replied, his voice flat. I saw the moment the light went out in Vernon's eyes. It wasn't the cuffs that broke him. It wasn't the cuffs that broke him. It was the realization that the attorney he had paid to shield his legacy had been the first to file evidence against him. It was a poetic irony that resonated deep in my bones. He had been so obsessed with hoarding power that he hadn't noticed he was paying the very person who would serve as his executioner. As they led them through the ballroom, the guests parted like the Red Sea. Some were recording with their phones, others were simply staring, their expressions a mix of horror and morbid curiosity. I stepped out of the shadows just enough so that Vernon would see me as he passed. I made sure our eyes met. In that look, I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to gloat. My silence was the most profound punishment I could deliver. I wanted him to see in those final seconds of his freedom that he hadn't been defeated by a rival company or a sudden market shift. He had been defeated by a father who loved his daughter more than he loved his own soul. He had been defeated by the very person he thought was a charity case. "Did you know?" Brock shouted over his shoulder, his voice thick with a mix of fury and desperation. "Everything. Did you know about all of it from the day we married?" I watched him go, my expression as immobile as a statue. I had known. I had heard every word, tracked every movement, and validated every atrocity. I had watched him poison my daughter with a ring and orchestrate her death for a payout. And now he was headed to a place where he would never again have the power to hurt anyone. The doors swung shut, sealing them off from the ballroom. The silence that rushed back into the room was absolute. I felt a hand on my shoulder. Samantha's. She was standing beside me, her silhouette regal in the cobalt blue couture, her presence a testament to everything I had worked for. She didn't look back at the doors either. She looked forward, her gaze focused on the life she was finally, undeniably entitled to claim. "It's done," she said, her voice steady. "It is," I agreed. "But the legacy isn't yours until you build it. They are in the past, Samantha. We have to look at the future." I signaled to Desmond, who was already coordinating the next steps with the legal team. The foundation needed to be announced, the press release needed to be finalized, and the work of restitution needed to begin. There was no time for rest. There was only time for the next move. I looked at the Biltmore Ballroom, a place of opulence and superficiality, and saw it for what it truly was, a graveyard for the Caldwell name. They had walked in here believing they were the kings of the mountain. They were leaving as cautionary tales. "Let's go home," I said, offering her my arm. We walked out of the ballroom together, leaving behind the whispers and the cameras. As we entered the cool night air of Los Angeles, I took a deep, steady breath. The city felt different tonight. It felt like a circuit board that had finally been cleared of a virus. The Caldwells were gone, the secrets were buried, and the only thing left was the clean, sharp potential of what remained. I knew that in the days ahead, the press would clamor for a statement. They would want the story of the billionaire and the daughter and the dramatic arrest. I would give them a version of the truth stripped of the pain, polished for the public eye. But the real story, the one involving the ring, the trash, the long years of silence, and the unwavering resolve of a father, would stay here with us. We had written our chapter, and it was a masterpiece of cold, calculated justice. As we stepped into the car, I glanced back at the Biltmore one last time. A part of my life, a part of my daughter's spirit, had been scorched in the fires of that relationship, but we had emerged from the ashes. I was Thane Whitaker, and I had reclaimed my life, my honor, and most importantly, my daughter. The city lights glimmered like stars in the distance. The battle was over, but the work, the real work of building a legacy that wasn't built on theft, was just beginning. The dismantling of an empire is not unlike the demolition of a skyscraper. It requires precision, patience, and the understanding that gravity once triggered does the vast majority of the work for you. I sat in my office on the 45th floor, watching the news ticker scroll across my screen. Caldwell Construction declares bankruptcy. The headlines read, "Assets seized, CEO faces federal investigation." It was a sterile, impersonal end to a life of calculated malice. I sipped my coffee, the heat radiating through the ceramic while I reviewed the final asset liquidation report. Vernon Caldwell had spent 30 years building an image of prosperity, a facade of marble and steel that he believed was impenetrable. He didn't understand that he had built it on borrowed ground, and I was the one who held the deed. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. Triumph suggests a contest between equals. This had been an extermination of parasites. "Desmond," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast office, "begin the transfer of the Caldwell assets into the Samantha Whitaker Foundation. I want the deed to their Pasadena residence transferred by noon. If Marlene Caldwell is still in that house, notify the sheriff's office to begin eviction proceedings immediately." "She is still there, sir," Desmond replied, standing in the doorway with his tablet held like a weapon. "She has been barricaded in the master suite since the arrests. She's claiming the house is marital property exempt from the seizure." I let out a sharp, cold laugh. "Marital property? She's living in a building owned by Whitaker Holdings. She is a squatter in her own delusions. Evict her. I want the house cleared of all Caldwell presence by evening. I want the locks changed, the security codes wiped, and the property prepped for renovation. When I bought that house in 2019, I told myself I would one day reclaim it. That day is today." I looked out the window, watching the skyline of Los Angeles. Somewhere down there, Marlene was packing her designer bags, the bags she had bought with stolen money, wondering how the world she had curated had turned against her. She was a woman who had built her entire identity on being the matriarch of the Caldwells. And now that the name was synonymous with fraud, she was a woman without a country. I thought back to that Thanksgiving dinner, to her smile as she handed over that stolen jade bracelet to Sienna. She had loved the performance of power, loved the way people bowed to her because she had the Caldwell name attached to her own. Now the name was radioactive. I had ensured that anyone associated with Vernon or Brock would be blacklisted from every reputable firm in the city. The Caldwells were now digital ghosts. Their credit scores erased their reputations, incinerated their very existence in the social hierarchy of Los Angeles, obliterated. "What about Vanessa?" I asked, checking my ledger. "She has fled to her mother's home in Phoenix," Desmond noted. "She has no funds. Brock's accounts were drained the night of the signing. She is essentially destitute." "Good." I said, not as an act of cruelty, but as a statement of fact. She traded her morals for proximity to what she thought was power. Now she has neither. I closed the folder. The Caldwells were not just bankrupt, they were irrelevant. I had stripped them of their money, their home, their legacy, and most importantly, their ability to ever inflict pain on another person again. But there was one final task. I stood up and pulled on my coat. I had to pay a visit to the one place that still felt like a wound, The Pasadena residence was quiet as I pulled the Mercedes up the driveway. The movers were already there, trucks loaded with the debris of a life stolen from me. Marlene was standing on the porch, her face pale and haggard. The burgundy silk robe she had worn that Thanksgiving dinner now crumpled and stained. She looked at my car, then at me as I stepped out, her eyes widening with a mixture of terror and realization. She finally saw me. She finally realized who I was, the man who had watched her listen to her and destroyed her from the shadows. You, she whispered the word escaping her lips like a prayer for mercy that I would never grant. You bought it. I didn't stop to offer pleasantries. I didn't stop to explain the mechanics of her ruin. I walked up the porch steps, my eyes locked onto the front door, the very door I had walked Samantha through 5 years ago to start this experiment. The locks have been changed, I said, my voice as hard as stone. You have 30 minutes to vacate the property, Marlene. If you aren't gone by then, I will have the police escort you from the premises. This is my home. I raised my son here. I built this life. You built nothing, I said, pausing just inches from her. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. You lived in my house. You spent my money, and you helped plot the murder of my daughter. You are lucky I am not having you arrested alongside them. Leave now, or I will ensure you spend the rest of your life in a cell just like theirs. She looked at me, truly looked at me, and saw the abyss. She didn't argue. She didn't scream. She turned her shoulders sagging under the weight of the reality that had finally crushed her and walked back into the house to gather the last of her miserable belongings. I stood on the porch watching the rain start to fall again, the same rain that had washed away her power at the Biltmore. I had reclaimed my house. I had reclaimed my ground. I looked at the house one last time, the place where my daughter had scrubbed floors and endured humiliation. It was mine again. And by tomorrow it would be the new headquarters for the foundation that would ensure no woman ever had to live the life my daughter had lived. The circle was closed. The foundation was laid. And for the first time in 5 years, the air in this place felt clean. I stepped down from the porch, entered my car, and drove away without looking back at the house that had once been the center of my daughter's suffering. The demolition was complete. Now it was time to move on to the next chapter of a story that I had finally truly written. I returned to the office as evening began to fall, the city lights beginning to pulse like the heart of a machine I now controlled. My daughter was in her own suite at the estate, resting, finally safe, finally home. The Caldwells were in holding cells, their lawyers already scrambling to find a defense that didn't exist. My foundation was active, my reputation was ironclad, and the stolen patent was finally being restored to the Aldridge estate. I sat at my desk and opened the final drawer. Inside lay the ring, the $12 piece of junk that had held the entire narrative of their destruction within its cheap metal band. I didn't need it anymore. I reached out and traced the surface of the ring one last time, a symbol of the war I had waged, the war I had won. I picked up the pen and signed the order for the Foundation's inaugural scholarship dedicated to the memory of Thomas Aldridge. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the last act of a man who had waited for 30 years to balance the scales of justice. Desmond, I called out, my voice resonant and strong. The transition is complete. Schedule a meeting with the board for tomorrow morning. I want to discuss the future of the Whitaker Group now that the distraction is removed. Yes, sir, he replied, appearing in the doorway. Anything else, sir? No, I said, leaning back in my chair, looking out at the vast, sprawling beauty of the city I now commanded. That will be all. Tonight I think I'd like to have dinner with my daughter. A real dinner. In a real home. He nodded, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips, and left me alone. I looked out at the city, the lights glittering like cold diamonds against the dark fabric of the night. I had played the game, I had faced the monsters, and I had come out on the other side. My daughter was safe, the Caldwells were destroyed, and the truth was finally, irrevocably mine. It was a good night to be alive. The library was bathed in the soft amber glow of the hearth, a sharp, welcome contrast to the cold, sterile marble floors of the apartment where I had spent 5 years watching my daughter endure indignity after indignity. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows against the spines of books that had stood here for generations, shielding us from the wreckage of the world outside. I sat in my high-backed armchair, a heavy leather volume resting unread on my lap, waiting. The door opened with the soft, almost imperceptible click. Samantha entered. She was wearing simple loungewear, her hair loose, her face devoid of the layers of makeup she had been forced to wear for years to conceal the map of bruises the Caldwells had etched onto her skin. She looked young, truly terrifyingly young for the first time in half a decade. The crushing weight of the last 5 years seemed to have evaporated from her shoulders, yet I could still see the phantom tension in her posture, the way she instinctively braced herself when I shifted in my chair. "Can't sleep?" I asked, my voice as gentle as I could possibly make it. My throat felt tight, a constriction born of a lifetime of holding back words I was finally allowed to speak. She walked slowly toward the fire and sank onto the ottoman near my feet, staring into the flames. She didn't look at me yet. "It's too quiet, Dad. For 5 years, the silence meant Brock was coming home, or Marlene was about to call, or the air was about to explode with some new demand. Now, the silence just feels hollow. It feels like I'm waiting for a shoe to drop." I watched her, my heart aching with a profound, searing love that I had been forced to cage, to hide behind the cold mask of the chairman and to bury beneath the surveillance reports. I wanted to reach out to pull her into my arms and promise her that the world would never touch her again. But I knew better. She needed to know that she hadn't just been rescued. She had rebuilt her own walls. She needed to own her survival. "Silence isn't empty, Samantha," I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Silence is the only space where you can find the parts of yourself you were forced to hide. You didn't lose 5 years. You gained a strength that most people never find in a lifetime, even if they live to be 100. The world thinks you were a victim. I know you were a soldier." She finally looked at me, and for a fleeting moment I saw the girl who had once ridden horses across this estate with the wind in her hair, the girl who believed that the world was hers to explore. "Do you ever regret it? Letting me go, letting me suffer while you watched from your monitors? You could have stopped it at any moment. You could have walked in, laid down your checkbook, and ended it on day one." The question hung in the air, heavier than any indictment I had ever filed against the Caldwells. It was the question that had haunted my nights, the one I had rehearsed 1,000 times in the dark. I knew the prepared corporate answers, the ones about character building and long-term strategy. But now, with her eyes searching mine for the truth, those words felt like shallow, pathetic excuses. "I regret every second I wasn't there to hold your hand," I admitted, my voice dropping, stripped of all my chairman's authority. "I regret that I chose justice over your immediate comfort. But I also know with the cold, agonizing certainty that keeps me awake at night that if I had saved you, you would have spent the rest of your life wondering if you were strong enough to save yourself. I didn't let you suffer to punish you, Samantha. I let you suffer so that when you finally stood up, you would know with absolute, unshakable conviction that no one in this world could ever break you again. I gave you the ability to survive anything. I just pray I didn't take too much of your light in the process." She didn't cry. The tears were for victims, and she had transcended that. She just leaned her head against my knee, a gesture of trust that felt like the most profound victory I had ever achieved. "I am strong," she whispered, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "You are a Whitaker," I replied, my hand trembling slightly as I smoothed her hair, careful not to press too hard against the fading phantom of her trauma. "And Whitaker women do not break. We endure, we adapt, and we win. But winning means nothing if you don't keep the pieces of yourself that make you human." I sat there for hours, the fire burning low, listening to the steady rhythmic sound of her breathing. It was a peaceful sound, the sound of a daughter who was finally undeniably safe. I didn't need the surveillance ring anymore. I didn't need the records, the spreadsheets, or the black budget tactical teams. I only needed this. I thought about the years ahead. There would be therapy. There would be time. There would be the long, slow, exhausting process of reclaiming the joy that had been systematically stolen from her. But tonight there was only the fire, the quiet and the ironclad knowledge that the people who had tried to extinguish her light were currently sitting in the dark of a prison cell, wondering exactly where they had gone wrong. "Dad," she asked, her voice heavy with sleep. "Yes, sweetheart. Thank you for listening. Even when I thought I was alone, I knew you were there." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I just held her hand, feeling the pulse in her wrist, steady, strong, and undeniably alive. The storm had passed. The empire of lies had crumbled. And for the first time in 30 years, I felt that perhaps, just perhaps, the scales of justice had finally tipped in the right direction. The night stretched out before us, vast and unmapped. Tomorrow I would continue to lead the Whitaker group, and Samantha would begin the work of her foundation. We were not the same people we had been 5 years ago. We were scarred, hardened, and irrevocably changed, but in the silence of the library under the protective roof of our own home, I knew one thing for certain: we were finally home. And that, in the end, was the only revenge that truly mattered. I had spent my life building a name that was feared and respected, but tonight, all I wanted was to be the man who held his daughter's hand in the dark. I had reclaimed my life, I had reclaimed my honor, and most importantly, I had reclaimed my daughter. The Caldwells were a bad memory, a brief, violent interlude in a history that would belong to us once more. I looked into the fire, watching the last of the embers pulse with a dying heat. I thought of Thomas Aldridge, the man whose stolen genius had started this entire chain of events. I had restored his name, I had vindicated his struggle, and I had protected his legacy. I had done what I promised, and now I was finally, utterly at peace. The weight of the world was off my shoulders, and the only thing that mattered was the steady warmth of the hearth and the woman sleeping at my feet. The future was no longer something I needed to manipulate or control. It was something I could finally watch happen alongside the person I loved most in the world. And that, I realized, was the greatest triumph of all. As the clock struck 3, I finally allowed myself to lean back and close my eyes. The war was over, and I had won everything that was worth keeping. The morning light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office did not carry the stale, artificial clarity of the artificial lights I had lived under for 5 years. It was real. It was the golden, piercing light of a Pacific dawn, and for the first time since Samantha married into that nest of vipers, it didn't feel like a countdown to an execution. It felt like the beginning of an era. I stood before the window, my reflection ghosting against the skyline of Los Angeles, a city I had navigated like a chessboard for decades. Behind me, the office was pristine, the surveillance monitors long since deactivated and replaced by the legitimate flourishing data of the Whitaker Group's global operations. The transformation was complete. The Caldwells were not just gone. They were historical footnotes buried under the weight of their own greed and the inexorable machinery of the justice I had set in motion. "Sir." Desmond's voice came from the doorway, soft and respectful. He didn't carry the tablet of a strategist today. He carried the simple physical presence of a trusted lieutenant. "The board is ready for the morning session. The Foundation's official launch is set for 10 a.m. Ms. Samantha is currently reviewing the final blueprints for the Pasadena Center." I turned a slow, deliberate movement. "The center," I mused. "It is fitting, isn't it, that the very soil where Vernon sought to bury my daughter's future is now the ground upon which she will build sanctuary for others?" "It is poetry, sir," Desmond agreed. "Poetry is for historians, Desmond. We are builders," I replied, my voice devoid of the cold, lethal edge it had carried for the better part of half a decade. "I am finished with building ruins. Today we build legacies." I walked toward the mahogany desk, my pace measured and steady. I didn't feel the phantom need to check the audio levels of a hidden transmitter, nor did I feel the compulsive drive to review the latest ledger of someone else's failures. My mind was clear, unburdened by the parasitic thoughts of the Caldwells. I was Thane Whitaker, and the world was mine to shape, not just to survive. My daughter walked in just as I was gathering my notes. She wore a tailored suit the color of a soft morning sky, and her posture was a lesson in quiet, unbreakable resilience. She looked like a CEO, like a philanthropist, but more importantly, she looked like herself. She didn't have the haunted, darting eyes of a woman who was constantly waiting for a blow. She was calm. She was whole. "I'm ready, Dad," she said, her voice steady. "The Pasadena staff is prepared. We have 500 applicants for the initial legal aid intake. The need is... It's overwhelming, but we are ready." I looked at her, and for a moment the weight of the last 5 years hit me not as a burden, but as a foundation. I had watched her get beaten, starved of affection, and poisoned, all while I sat in my library like a god observing a lab experiment. I had played the role of the silent witness because I had convinced myself that justice required sacrifice. I had been wrong. Justice didn't require her sacrifice. It required my courage to stand by her, to act when the time was right, and to trust that she was capable of becoming the woman I had always known she was. "You aren't just ready for this," I told her, stepping forward to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture I had refrained from making for 5 agonizing years. "You are the manifestation of everything I have ever valued. You prove that silence isn't submission, and that even the most broken stone can be used to build a fortress." She smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached her eyes, eyes that were now clear, free of the shadow of the Caldwells. "I didn't do it alone. You were there, Dad. Even when I couldn't see you, I knew you were there." "I was listening," I said, a rare choked admission. "I was listening to every single heartbeat, hoping that I was doing the right thing." You were, she replied. And now we move forward. We walked out of the office together, the high-heeled click of her shoes, and the steady tread of my own echoing through the marble hallways of the headquarters. I felt the gaze of my staff as we passed, not the fearful, obsequious stares they usually offered, but looks of genuine respect. They knew what had happened. They knew the Caldwells had fallen, and they knew who had held the blade. But they didn't know the cost, and they never would. As we descended to the main floor, I thought about Vernon and Brock in their cells in that gray, featureless world, where the only schedule they had to follow was the one imposed by the state. They would have decades to think about how they had gambled with the daughter of a Whitaker, and how they had lost everything for the sake of a $10 million insurance policy they would never see. They had died in their own way long before the FBI arrived. Their arrest was simply the official declaration of an extinction that had started the day they first touched my daughter. I walked into the ballroom where the launch was being held. It was filled with stakeholders, journalists, and activists, a crowd that looked to me for direction and to Samantha for inspiration. I took my seat on the stage, watching my daughter take the podium. The light hit her and she didn't shrink. She commanded the space. She spoke of the foundation of the women who needed legal aid, of the urgency of building a society where domestic cruelty could not hide in the dark. She was eloquent, fierce, and utterly compelling. I leaned back, my mind drifting for a moment. I remembered the $12 ring, the cheap, scratched, worthless piece of metal that had been my only connection to her during the darkest time of my life. I had the real thing now, my daughter breathing, thriving, and changing the world. The ring was in a museum-grade case, a relic of a war that had been fought and won, a reminder that even the most expensive empires are built on things that are in the end quite fragile. The applause began as she finished, a thunderous rolling sound that filled the room. I stood clapping for her, my eyes wet with a pride that finally had no need to be hidden. After the event, as the guests lingered over champagne and conversation, I stood by the door watching her work the room. She was navigating the crowd with a natural authority that would have made her mother proud. I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Desmond holding a folder. "The final audit of the Caldwell estate is complete, sir. Every cent has been moved to the foundation. The records are sealed and the legal teams are disbanded. The file is officially closed." I took the folder, but I didn't open it. I simply handed it back to him. "Burn it, Desmond." "Sir." "Burn it," I repeated. "I don't want to see another record, another transcript, or another ledger associated with that name. That chapter is finished. We are not writing about them anymore. We are writing about the future." "Yes, sir." I walked out of the ballroom into the late afternoon sun. The air was crisp and the sky was an endless, brilliant blue. I looked up at the sun, feeling its warmth on my skin, real and untainted. I had lived in the dark for 5 years, an observer in a world of shadows, but now the light was mine again. I had been a chairman, a strategist, a jailer, and a spy. But today, standing on the sidewalk of Los Angeles, I was just a father. And as Samantha walked out of the ballroom to meet me, taking my hand with a grip that was firm and unapologetic, I knew that this was the real beginning. The Caldwells were a bad dream, a brutal, violent, and utterly worthless memory. What lay ahead was a life built not on vengeance, but on the enduring, unshakable foundation of a family that had survived the impossible. I hailed the car, opened the door for my daughter, and climbed in beside her. The driver started the engine, and as we pulled away from the Whitaker Group headquarters, I didn't look back at the office, the records, or the city that had hosted our war. I looked ahead. "Where to, Dad?" Samantha asked, her voice filled with a lightness I hadn't heard in years. "Home," I said. "Just home." The car glided into the traffic, a sleek, powerful machine, navigating the streets of a city that was finally, after all these years, ours to live in. And as the horizon shifted and the sun set, I knew that whatever tomorrow held, we would face it together, not as survivors of a Caldwell nightmare, but as the architects of a dawn that no shadow could ever touch again. The transition from a man of vengeance to a man of legacy was not a sudden flick of a switch. It was a slow, deliberate recalibration of my soul. Now that the dust had settled and the Caldwells were rotting in the cold sterility of federal detention, the reality of my new life began to take hold. I sat in my office not as a hunter, but as the patriarch of a restored empire. The Whitaker Group was no longer just a collection of assets. It was the engine that would fuel the values I had fought so hard to reclaim. I looked at the portrait of my wife that hung above the fireplace in my private study, a painting I had kept hidden from the world for years, fearing that the Caldwells might use it as another tool of manipulation. Her eyes seemed to hold a quiet, knowing pride. I had finished the task. I had shielded her legacy from the parasites, and I had ensured that our daughter would never have to be a victim of a man like Vernon ever again. Desmond, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room, I want the Whitaker Foundation to establish a permanent endowment for domestic abuse survivors. I don't want a charity. I want a fortress. I want legal support, housing, and counseling services that are completely untouchable by any outside interests. Make it the most formidable organization of its kind in the country. It will be done, sir. The infrastructure is already being drafted. I nodded, feeling a strange, quiet satisfaction. For 5 years, I had built a fortress of surveillance around my daughter. Now I was building a fortress of empowerment. The difference in my intent was the difference between a man who reacts to the world and a man who shapes it. I walked to the balcony, the crisp evening air of Los Angeles brushing against my face. The city lights were a glittering expanse, a circuit board of human endeavor. I no longer saw it as a map of enemies. I saw it as a garden that required a firm, protective hand. I had spent so long playing the part of the silent observer, the shadow that haunted the corridors of power, that I had almost forgotten what it meant to simply be present. My phone chimed a secure private line. It was Samantha. She was calling from the Foundation's new offices. Dad, I'm looking at the intake reports. You wouldn't believe how many women were exactly where I was. People who have the intelligence to build empires but are being systematically dismantled by people they trusted. It's a systemic rot. And that is exactly why we are there, Samantha, I said, my voice warming as I heard her enthusiasm. You are the living proof that the rot can be stopped. Every person you help is a victory against the kind of small-minded greed that tried to destroy us. Don't look at the rot. Look at the people you're pulling out of it. I know, she replied, her voice soft. It feels different now. I don't feel like I'm looking over my shoulder anymore. I feel like I'm looking ahead. That is what it means to be free, I said, a rare, genuine smile touching my lips. I hung up and stood there for a long moment watching the city breathe. I had won the war, but the peace was more demanding than I had ever anticipated. Peace required constant vigilance, not of cameras and wiretaps, but of heart and spirit. I had to learn to be a father again, to be a mentor, to be someone who contributed to the light rather than simply lurking in the dark. I had been the architect of shadows for far too long. I had manipulated, coerced, and dismantled with the precision of a surgeon. But that was a role I could no longer inhabit if I wanted to remain the man my daughter needed. The shadows had a way of clinging to you, of staining your hands in ways that never truly washed off. I needed to let the light in. I walked back to my desk and picked up a thick leather-bound volume. Not a ledger, not a file of evidence, but a historical account of the Whitaker family's contributions to the arts and sciences. I hadn't opened it in years. I had been too busy fighting for survival to remember that we were once creators. Desmond, I said as he entered the room, cancel all investigative briefings. From now on, our focus is purely developmental. I want to see the long-term projections for our clean energy initiative. I want to see how we can expand the scholarship program. I'm moving my focus from defense to growth. Desmond bowed his head, a look of genuine relief crossing his features. It is an honor to serve under the Whitaker Group's true vision, sir. I'll make the necessary arrangements. As he left, I sat in the chair that had once been the command center for my vengeance and realized that the world was still spinning just as it had always been. The greed, the ambition, the cruelty, it hadn't vanished. It was still out there in the boardrooms and the mansions and the dimly lit apartments across the city, but it no longer had a hold on me. I had learned the most important lesson of the shadow. The only way to truly defeat the darkness is to become the light that makes it impossible to hide. I had spent 5 years watching, waiting, and plotting. Now I would spend the rest of my life building, growing, and protecting. I opened the book, the pages smelling of history and possibility. I was no longer an observer. I was no longer a shadow. I was a man standing in the morning sun, finally ready to start the life I had almost lost to the greed of a family that didn't deserve the ground they walked on. The future was not something I had to control anymore. It was something I had the privilege to help create. And as I turned the first page, I knew that for the first time in my life, I was finally truly in control. The ink on the settlement agreements had dried weeks ago, but the psychological remnants of the war still occasionally surfaced in the quietude of my private study. It was a strange sensation to be the master of a multi-billion-dollar empire, yet find myself frequently glancing at the empty space on my desk where the surveillance ring once sat. The silence that had once been my greatest tool for gathering intelligence was now merely the atmosphere of a home finally restored to its rightful inhabitants. I spent my mornings reviewing the expansion of the Whitaker Foundation. Samantha had become a force of nature, a woman whose empathy was matched only by her resolve. She didn't just want to provide aid. She wanted to tear down the societal barriers that allowed predators like the Fosters to operate with such casual impunity. "Dad," she said, entering my office with a stack of blueprints for the new legal aid center. "The city council has approved the zoning for the Pasadena facility. They're calling it the Whitaker Center for Equity. It feels strange to have our name on it. For so long, I thought the name Whitaker was the reason they targeted me. I spent so much time hiding it, trying to be the person they wanted me to be." I looked at the blueprints, bold, clean lines that represented a future built on transparency and protection. I saw the architectural integrity of the design, a structure meant to be open, accessible, and impenetrable to the kind of predatory exploitation that had defined her marriage. "The name Whitaker was never the target, Samantha," I said, rising to stand beside her. "Your compassion was. They were terrified of you because they knew deep down that you were capable of everything they were not. They didn't target the Whitaker name, they targeted the humanity they could never possess." I looked at her, watching the way she traced the outline of the building on the page. She was the architect of her own recovery, just as I had been the architect of her tormentor's downfall. It was a heavy realization, one that weighed on me more than any corporate merger I had ever facilitated. I had played God with their lives, and while the outcome was just the methodology, remained a scar on my own conscience. "Desmond," I called out, my voice resonating in the spacious room, "have we finished the final audit of the Caldwell's personal accounts? I want every cent that was siphoned from the Aldridge Patent Restoration Fund documented." "Every transaction has been traced and reconciled, sir." Desmond reported, his efficiency unchanged by the transition from war to peace. "The money has been returned to the original estate heirs. The legal team is finalizing the last of the restitution claims today." "Excellent. Then let the record reflect that the account is closed." I turned back to the window, watching the afternoon sun stretch over the estate. The Whitaker Group had stabilized. The volatility of the Caldwell crisis was a fading memory, replaced by the steady, predictable growth of a legacy that actually served a purpose. I realized then that for the past 5 years, I had been living in a state of hypervigilance, my senses tuned to the frequency of betrayal. Learning how to be a civilian again, a man who didn't view every phone call as a potential security breach, was a challenge in its own right. I walked to the safe in the wall, the one that had housed the evidence of their rot, and left it open. It was empty now, save for a few unimportant documents. I reached in and pulled out a small velvet-lined box containing the only thing I hadn't destroyed, the original, unadulterated birth certificate of my daughter, and a photo of her as a child. These were the items that grounded me, the artifacts of a life that existed before the shadows. I spent the next few hours simply organizing the past, placing items into archival storage, and ensuring that our family history was preserved, not the history of the war, but the history of the family. I thought about Vernon and Brock sitting in their cells. I didn't hate them anymore. Hate required a level of emotional investment that they were no longer worth. They were merely the consequences of their own choices, isolated in a world they had built for themselves. The law was handling the rest, and I was satisfied to simply be a footnote in their decline. "Sir," Desmond said, pausing at the threshold, "the Attorney General's office has requested your presence for a debrief on the corruption case. It is purely formal, but your testimony is the final seal on the charges against the City Planning Commission." "I'll be there," I said, closing the safe. "It is the final duty I owe to this city. Once that is done, I want to be off the grid for a month. No meetings, no boardrooms, no news, just the estate." "Understood, sir. I will clear your calendar." As the evening deepened, I sat alone in the library, the fire casting a soft glow on the walls. The house felt lighter, the air cleaner. I had dismantled a dynasty of cruelty, protected my child, and built a foundation of justice, all from the comfort of this very room. I looked at the desk where the surveillance console had once sat, and felt nothing but the quiet hum of a house at peace. I had spent my life as the architect of shadows, but as I looked at the path ahead, I realized I had finally earned the right to just be the man behind the desk. I was a father, a leader, and a builder. The war was behind me, and for the first time in an eternity, the future was an unwritten page waiting for the ink of a life lived in the light. I stood up, adjusted my blazer, and prepared to leave. The city waited for me, but it would have to wait for someone else now. The man of business, not the man of shadows. I walked to the front door, the heavy wood swinging open to reveal the cool evening air. I took a deep breath, the taste of freedom more intoxicating than any victory I had ever claimed. The path back to the car was lit by the garden lamps, their soft light cutting through the dusk. I didn't look back at the library or the safe or the monitors. I looked toward the gate, toward the world that was waiting, and for the first time in years, I wasn't watching the perimeter. I was simply walking through the front door into the life I had saved. The final chapter of this 5-year vigil was not written in a courtroom or a boardroom. It was written in the quiet, mundane moments of a Sunday morning at the Whitaker estate. The chaos, the fear, the strategic maneuvering, all of it had receded into the past, leaving behind the steady, rhythmic pulse of a life reclaimed. I stood in the glass-enclosed atrium of the estate watching Samantha in the gardens. She was tending to the hydrangeas, her movements deliberate and serene. The terror that had once haunted her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, fierce determination. She was the architect of her own peace now, and I was merely an observer, a silent guardian watching over the sanctuary we had forged from the ashes of her suffering. My role as the architect of shadows had reached its natural expiration. I no longer needed to monitor the perimeter, no longer needed to decrypt their communications, no longer needed to manipulate their ruin. They were already gone, existing only as cautionary case studies in the files of the Justice Department and as bitter, rotting memories in the minds of the men who had once dared to threaten my blood. "Desmond," I murmured, feeling the weight of the last half-decade finally slipping from my shoulders. "Do you remember the first night I opened the feed, the night she married him?" "I do, sir," Desmond replied, his presence as constant and reliable as the ticking of a clock. "It was the night you decided that you would be the observer until the very last possible moment." I was a fool, I admitted, my voice carrying a note of self-reflection I hadn't allowed myself for years. I thought I could master their cruelty by studying it. I thought I could outthink their malice. But I was just another player in their game for too long. I should have ended it the moment I saw him raise his hand to her. "But if you had, sir, she would not have become the woman she is today." Desmond countered, his tone respectful yet firm. "She needed to walk through that fire to forge her own steel. You provided the forge, sir. You didn't make her burn." I looked out at her again. He was right, yet the guilt remained a permanent shadow in the corners of my mind. I had held the power of a god, and I had used it to observe. I would live with that for the rest of my days. But as I watched her laugh at something the gardener said, I knew that the cost had been calculated correctly. She was safe, she was powerful, and she was free. I returned to my study, the room that had once been the command center for my vengeance. It felt different now. The air was no longer thick with the urgency of strategy, it was merely air. I sat at my desk and opened the final file, a blank ledger. For 5 years, every page had been filled with the records of their corruption, their movements, and their failures. Now, for the first time, I looked at a page that contained nothing. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was the future. I didn't need to be the architect anymore. The shadows were no longer mine to inhabit. I was simply a father, a man who had walked through the dark so his daughter wouldn't have to carry the burden of it herself. I had been the silent guardian, the man behind the curtain, the hand in the dark. Now it was time to step out of the shadows entirely. I picked up the surveillance console, the last remnant of my clandestine life, and disconnected it from the main server. With one swift motion, I deactivated the encrypted feeds, wiped the hard drives, and pulled the power supply. The black screens flickered and died, leaving me in the soft, natural light of the afternoon. I wasn't blind anymore. I was simply done looking for threats. "Desmond," I called out one final time. "Yes, sir." "Destroy the archives, all of them. I don't want a single trace of the Caldwell operation to remain in this house. Let the past stay in the past." "Immediately, sir." I sat back in my chair, the silence of the room finally becoming a comfort rather than a diagnostic tool. I had reclaimed my life, my daughter, and my soul. I was Thane Whitaker, the man who had torn down an empire to save a single light. And as the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful rays across my desk, I realized that for the first time in years I was not planning for tomorrow. I was simply existing today. The war was over. The shadows were gone. And for the first time in an eternity, the man behind the desk was finally irrevocably at peace. The victory at the Biltmore and the subsequent collapse of the Caldwell Empire had provided me with the external peace I had craved for years. But as the adrenaline of battle faded, it left behind a quiet, nagging introspection that no amount of corporate success could silence. I sat in my private study, the room where the architect of shadows had spent countless nights manipulating the strings of my enemies' lives, and found that the silence was now an invitation to look at the strings I had been pulling for my own daughter. For 5 years, I had convinced myself that my surveillance was a shield. I had convinced myself that every micro-adjustment I made to Samantha's environment, the chance encounters with Nadine, the hidden financial buffers, the deliberate leaks that steered the Fosters toward their own destruction, was a necessary act of paternal duty. But as I stared at the blank screens of my terminal, I was struck by a cold, unsettling thought. Where had my role as a protector ended, and where had my role as a manipulator begun? I had been so obsessed with shielding her from the darkness of the world that I had essentially built a miniature controlled world around her. I had stage-managed her pain so that I could ensure her outcome. Even now, as she built her foundation, I found myself instinctively checking the backgrounds of her staff, vetting her potential partners, and ensuring that no shadow, no matter how small, could fall across her path. I was the puppeteer who had cut the strings of the Caldwells, but I had yet to cut the strings that connected me to Samantha. "Desmond," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness of the library. Desmond stepped out of the shadows, his presence as precise and unobtrusive as ever. "Yes, sir. The security protocols regarding Samantha's daily movements." I began, my gaze fixed on the dying embers of the fireplace. "They are excessive. I have people following her to her meetings, tracking her private communications, and ensuring her safety to a degree that is frankly stifling." Desmond remained silent for a moment, his professional demeanor holding a mirror to my own internal conflict. "You have spent 5 years protecting her from a targeted threat, sir. It is a habit of mine that does not vanish overnight." "It isn't just a habit," I corrected him, standing up to walk toward the window. The city lights were brilliant, a sprawling network of freedom, yet I felt anchored by my own reluctance to let go. "It's a control mechanism. I have spent so much time being the architect, the man who ensures the result, that I have forgotten that the most important result of Samantha's life is her own autonomy. If I continue to curate her life, am I any better than the people who tried to cage her for their own gain?" The thought was a physical blow. I had destroyed Vernon Caldwell for his arrogance, for his belief that he had the right to determine the trajectory of my daughter's life. And yet here I was doing the exact same thing, merely with more refined tools and a more benevolent intention. I was still pulling the strings, still directing the play, still ensuring that the path remained clear. I looked down at the courtyard where Samantha was currently speaking with the architects for her new legal center. She was gesturing with confidence, her voice animated, her laugh echoing up toward my balcony. She wasn't acting out a part I had written. She was living. She was making mistakes, she was debating, she was growing. My interference, no matter how well-intended, was a glass ceiling that I had placed over her head, one she couldn't see, but one I knew was there. "I want the surveillance stopped, Desmond," I said, my voice firm, stripping away the last of my hesitations. "I want you to recall the security detail. I want her communications to be private, not just private from others, private from me." Desmond hesitated. "Sir, if something were to happen—" "If something happens, she will handle it," I interrupted. "And if she cannot handle it, she will learn how to handle it. That is the lesson I denied her while I was busy playing the architect. I need to be her father, Desmond. Not her guard, not her director, just her father." The realization settled over me, profound and liberating. For years, I had treated Samantha as an extension of my own resolve, a piece on the board that I needed to move to safety. I had failed to see that she had long since outgrown the board. She had endured the Caldwells, she had survived the poisoning, and she had built a foundation for others. She was a woman of immense power, and I was holding her back by refusing to step out of the spotlight. I walked back to my desk and picked up the controller for the last of the private monitoring systems. It was a small, unassuming device, yet it represented the culmination of my fear. My thumb hovered over the power button. For a moment, a wave of panic washed over me, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the risks that exist in a world where I am not in total control. But then I looked at my daughter again and I saw her independence. I pressed the button. The screens went black one by one. The red light of the recording indicators faded into the darkness. The stream of data that had been the heartbeat of my existence for 5 years ceased to flow. I was blind. I was vulnerable. I was exactly where I needed to be. "Is it done, sir?" Desmond asked, his voice low. "It is done," I whispered. I felt a surge of lightness in my chest, a sensation of breath finally returning to lungs that had been restricted for too long. I have no idea where she is going to have lunch tomorrow, or who she is going to meet at the center, or what challenges she will face. And for the first time in my life, I am okay with that. I sat back in my chair and watched the room. The library, which had been a war room for half a decade, was finally just a room. The stress, the manipulation, the cold, calculating detachment of the architect had vanished. I was no longer the man who lived in the shadows. I was simply a man in a house in a city watching his daughter grow up. I realized then that the final enemy I had to defeat wasn't Vernon or Brock or the corruption of the city. It was my own desperate need to ensure that the outcome of her life was guaranteed. I had to let go of the strings. If they were to hold, it wouldn't be because I was pulling them. It would be because she was strong enough to hold on to them herself. The weight of the last few years finally settled into its rightful place, a memory, a chapter, a lesson. I had successfully managed to save her from them, but now I had to save her from myself. I had to give her the greatest gift a father could offer, the freedom to make her own mistakes, to face her own dangers, and to write her own ending. "Desmond," I said, standing up and walking toward the door. "Cancel the afternoon board meeting. I think I'll go down to the garden. I have a daughter to talk to, and I have nothing to report." As I walked out of the library, leaving the black screens behind, I realized that the silence was no longer empty. It was full of possibilities. It was the sound of a life that wasn't being managed, a life that was finally being lived. I had stepped out of the shadows, and as I walked toward the garden, the sunlight was no longer just light. It was a promise. I was no longer the architect of shadows. I was finally at long last just a father. The air at the edge of the Pacific is different. At dawn, it is sharp, salt-crusted, and carries the weight of a world that is constantly in flux. I stood on the cliffside of my private estate, the hem of my coat whipping in the morning breeze. In my hand I held a heavy brass-bound ledger, the physical manifestation of 5 years of surveillance manipulation and vengeance. It was the Black Ledger, the repository of every secret, every fraudulent transaction, every audio transcript, and every calculated move I had made to ensure the destruction of the Caldwells. It was heavy, not just with paper and ink, but with the darkness I had cultivated to keep my daughter safe. I had come here to finish the cycle. Throughout these years, I had acted as the judge, jury, and executioner, convinced that the only way to protect what I loved was to become something more dangerous than what threatened it. But standing here watching the horizon bleed from charcoal gray into a vibrant, defiant orange, I realized that keeping this ledger was no longer an act of protection. It was an anchor to a ghost. "It is all here, isn't it?" I didn't turn. I knew the footsteps, steady, composed, and devoid of the hesitant tremor they had held only weeks ago. Samantha walked up beside me, her gaze fixed on the same churning ocean. She wasn't looking at the ledger with fear, but with a quiet, analytical understanding. She knew what it was. She had lived the fallout of the information inside it. "Every secret, every betrayal, and every life-altering decision I made in the shadows," I said, my voice barely audible over the crashing surf. "It's a record of a war that no one else truly understood. I thought that by holding on to this, I was holding on to justice, but now it feels like I'm just holding on to the rot." She turned to me, and in her eyes I saw a wisdom that had been forged in the crucible of her own suffering. "You held it so I wouldn't have to carry the weight of the truth. I understand that, Dad. I truly do. But you're right. If you keep looking back at the map of the war, you'll never see the road ahead." I looked down at the ledger. It was a masterpiece of cold corporate efficiency, a testament to the fact that I had outplayed Vernon Caldwell at every turn. But it was also the record of the moment I had nearly lost myself to the need for control. I had been willing to burn everything down to see them pay. I had been willing to sacrifice my own peace to ensure theirs was shattered. "I'm done with the ledger," I said, my grip on the brass binding loosening. "I don't want to be the man who kept these secrets. I want to be the man who made sure they never mattered again." "Then let it go," she said simply. I didn't hesitate. I stepped toward the edge of the cliff. The wind howled as if in anticipation. With a single fluid motion, I cast the ledger out over the abyss. It didn't fall like a stone. It seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat, a collection of dark secrets being reclaimed by the wild, indifferent vastness of the sea. It hit the water and vanished the waves, swallowing the evidence of 5 years of tactical warfare without a trace. It was gone. The accounts, the audio logs, the illicit surveillance, all of it buried beneath miles of salt and silence. I felt a sudden profound shift in my center of gravity. I wasn't just lighter, I was unburdened. The architect of shadows had finally retired. "What now?" Samantha asked, leaning against the railing, her profile illuminated by the rising sun. "Now." I looked at her, then back at the horizon where the first true light of the day was hitting the water, turning the turbulent gray into a shimmering expanse of gold. "Now we live, not as the people who survived, but as the people who choose what happens next." The Whitaker name is no longer associated with the Caldwell downfall, nor is it associated with the dark surveillance of the last 5 years. From this day forward, Whitaker is synonymous with growth, with equity, and with a future that doesn't look back. "I like the sound of that," she replied, her smile small, genuine, and entirely her own. "It's not just a sound, Samantha, it's a promise." We stood there for a long time, watching the sun rise fully, the warmth of it finally reaching my skin, penetrating the armor I had worn for half a decade. I had been a man of shadows, a manipulator of reality, and a cold-blooded strategist. But as I walked away from the cliffside, leaving the secrets to the ocean, I felt the sharp, exhilarating bite of a life being lived in the open. I took her hand, a simple human gesture, and we walked toward the estate. My phone remained silent in my pocket, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care who was calling or what was happening in the world. The Whitaker Group would thrive, the foundation would change lives, and the past was a closed book archived in the depths of the Pacific. I had reclaimed my daughter's future, and in doing so, I had finally reclaimed my own. The architect had completed his final design, a life of freedom. I had spent years obsessed with the ledger of their sins, always calculating the debt they owed. But standing there realizing that I was no longer keeping score, I understood that the only debt that had ever mattered was the one I owed to my daughter, the debt of her happiness, her autonomy, and her right to a world where she didn't have to look over her shoulder. I had paid that debt in full. As we reached the house, the light was brilliant, bathing the estate in a radiance that felt like a baptism. I looked at the grand doors of the estate, then at the sprawling gardens, and I knew that this place was finally home again. Not a base of operations, not a command center, not a cage, just a home. I closed the door behind us, sealing out the noise of the world and leaving the shadows behind. The ledger was at the bottom of the sea, the enemies were in chains, and the path ahead was completely, beautifully empty. I had been the architect of shadows, but today I was simply a father. And as I walked into the kitchen to prepare the first breakfast of a life that was finally mine, I realized that the simple, quiet, uncomplicated act of living was the greatest victory of all. The story of the shadows was over. The story of our lives was just beginning. People often ask what I'd change. I've sat with that question long enough to answer honestly, I'd change the silence. Most family story arcs don't begin with betrayal. They begin with a man who loved someone too much to speak his truth. I was that man. I traded honest communication for a long game, and I nearly lost the only person who mattered. God sees what is yours, but he also gave you a voice, and silence is never the same as faith. If you see your own family story reflected in these mistakes, take this advice, speak, while the evidence is still warm. Family betrayal isn't a storm you can outwait, it's a rot you must excise. Don't be the architect of shadows, be the light. My journey through this family betrayal taught me that revenge is a hollow victory if it costs you your connection to the ones you love. If your family story is currently defined by secrets, remember that the record can always be corrected, but the years of lost trust cannot. True power isn't controlling the outcome, it's having the courage to face the truth together. In every family betrayal, the most dangerous person is the one who keeps everything inside until it explodes. Don't let your family story end in an empty library, build it on the bedrock of absolute honesty. If this journey resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think I was right to let the trap unfold, or should I have intervened sooner? Drop a comment below, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more deep dives into the architecture of life and legacy. Thank you for following this journey to the very end.